And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. Oh, what a fantastic crowd we have out there in the ideas room tonight already. Of course, tonight I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, it's Alex's world, I guess.
Yes,
Huh?
actually, I have some comments to share on that.
Okay.
Io Ata said DJ on AJ was like my dream come true. So cool. And Skunk5 says DJ is like the Mr. Spock to Alex's Captain Kirk. One cold, factual, the other a trailblazer with passion. Love it.
This was fun. Look, this is really interesting. Alex was very gracious to have us on his show. And when I was on there, there's a few things. If you listen to Alex, he is such a depth of deep state knowledge, but this is a guy who has deep curiosity about things like the UFO file. And I'm not sure that's quite found expression on his show, but he knows a lot about it. And it's interesting when we were talking, he was picking up on threads quite well. And so I think you're going to see some interesting things there. If you haven't seen it, that clip is in the newsletter, and we also have it in our Twitter feed and on Facebook and stuff. But it was a great time, and there was a lot of simpatico there. It was also nice that we were able to talk about Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s candidacy, and Alex knows a great deal about the Kennedy assassination, and so I was able to talk with him about that and the deep state resistance to it. We're seeing a lot of that resistance right now, in fact, going on where, he went on ABC News recently for an interview, and they just chopped everything that he said and said, oh, it's medical misinformation, and that's the end of that. So this is somebody who's going to be suppressed, which means it's going to be up to everyone on the independent side to really drive this message home and get the word out, whether you're Democrat, Republican, Independent, it doesn't matter. This guy needs to be in the ball game. So RFK Jr., I think, he's sort of the game changer for the 2024 election. And we had Trump up here in New Hampshire yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
So political season's on early this time around, and I think there's a good reason for that. Stepford Biden became very afraid of the advent of Bobby's candidacy. And so instead of announcing in September like he was going to, he decided, hey, I'm going to announce right now. And it was the worst weird video of him sort of mumbling around and them doing chop edits. So it's on. It's already on. And 2023 is the crucial setup year, because once you get into 2024, it's, that is really kinetic warfare. But this is the setup period. This is when, there's that Sun Tzu thing that wars are fought in the temple, and they're won or lost in the temples before they're ever fought. And that's kind of what we're talking about here. So if the deep state can run away with the narrative, then we're going to have problems. But if the independent cracks through it, and it's interesting, I went back through a lot of stats, and 93% of the then independent media supported President Trump's candidacy. Don't tell me that didn't make all the difference in the world. And in 2016, which was crucial, breakthrough, regardless of if you love Trump or not. Interestingly enough, also looking in that period of 2016, the independent media, but also Assange and his relentless WikiLeaks, revealing the facts on Hillary and her corruption and the things that had gone down there with them stealing the vote from Bernie Sanders. So, and it was very important. And Alex, of course, was very important for Trump's victory as well. There were a lot of factors that helped put that over the top, but they were driven from this independent side, make no mistake about it. And certainly removing the Biden regime and the kind of cancer on American politics that it's become is going to be the job of both the left and the right. So it's going to be RFK Jr. who smashes it in the Democratic Party, and the Trump forces on the other side. So both of those together, I think, are going to make 2024 absolutely remarkable. And we're going to get a break from politics tonight after all that, because we have a fantastic episode for you all about Atlantis, UFOs, and night side forces. This is a crucial X series 148 that we're bringing forward. And we're going to get deep into the ancient technology driving the conversation around advanced technology from an earlier period and how that spills over into our period, and how a number of these mystery schools knew, aha, this is going to come back one form or another. So we need to set people up and address this early on. And I'll show how anthroposophy and theosophy, the Cayce work, and others, including Philos the Tibetan, got this theme out there very early. As a matter of fact, in Philos' case, it's 1886.
Wow.
That's early. UFO file, 1886. I'm going to show you some of the UFOs that Philos had in Atlantis that he shows drawings of. This is quite unusual, and the whole story about Philos I'll get into. It's from a book called A Dweller on Two Planets. This is going to be a crucial aspect tonight. And I know we have a lot of new people with us tonight. What I want to stress is make sure you're on that newsletter list before we go any further. Go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for it. It's a free newsletter. It keeps us in touch through any kind of social media static or censorship that's going on. And as we go into political season, that becomes more and more important. And basically, you're going to hear about all the exciting shows that we have coming up for you. Mind-blowing X series episodes, phenomenal interviews. We just did one with Dr. Farrell, and of course, Gigi Young is coming up, and just a slew of incredible guests, really mind-blowing interviews, including Catherine Austin Fitz. And there are a couple of interviews. I can't mention them yet, but they're in the works, and we're just working out times. But they're going to be mind blowers and mind benders. So make sure you're on that list so you hear it first. Stand up and be counted, and make sure you're in there. Before I go any further, I'm going to mention that we're going to take questions in the second part of tonight's program, and Miss Olivia is going to be handling those. You can actually ask them right now. Do you still do them all in caps?
All in caps.
All in caps. Okay, so no comments, all in caps, just the questions, because that can get confusing. And you can even ask them now, and she's going to put them together for later. How's it going out there?
Great. What are nightside forces?
Well, we're going to get into that because it's a crucial aspect that the mystery schools left for us to ponder, and it's how Atlantis got into trouble, and I'm afraid we got our hands back in the nightside cookie jar, and we're going to get into that tonight. The nightside forces are crucial because they are the rediscovery in science of the mix of scientific and supernatural abilities. And this is exactly what the Atlanteans tripped into with the Two-Eye Stone. It had a dual purpose. And there's all these mentions of the supernatural in relation to the Two-Eye Stone. And then what's interesting is Cayce, when he's talking about the Atlantean airships, he addresses this aspect that they're driven by this nightside force. And over again, when nightside comes up, when he's reviewing the lives, these past lives that these people have had, because this is the Atlantean story is a pure reincarnation story. There's no question about it. There's no getting around it. I mean, Cayce was a Sunday school teacher, but this is reincarnation coming through the readings, and he had to get through it as a Christian. So the mystery schools teach that we have this reincarnation cycle. This is how he's able to tap into the lives and the subconscious memories of the people who came to him for these readings. So when he's reviewing that, some of these individuals who are associated with these nightside forces, over and over again, they're abused. And I selected those readings and took them out from the readings. A lot of these aren't even available in books. It's an interesting stat that I found out that only 22% of the actual Edgar Cayce readings are available in books. Isn't that a stunning figure?
What amount again?
22%.
Wow.
Yeah. So the other, 78% languishes there in the database, and people pull it out for different books and things. But it's an extraordinary research project. And I can tell you that for years, I spent time at the ARE library, going there and taking trips down there and just going through those incredible readings. And, I'm really thankful as I go through these Atlantis readings, because the people who came and asked the questions, one, we have the ability, it's kind of like someone goes in for reading, and it's a personal thing, but we have the ability now, so many years later, to review their personal readings. And those personal readings are how we get that whole tapestry of what happened in this period and the incredible readings that he gave them. So it's a combination effort. It's Cayce reaching in with his incredible psychic ability as the sleeping prophet and giving these readings to these people, but it's their questions, it's their prompting of him, and it's that whole effort of activity of those people that ricochets out into the period that we're in. And this, I think, is the kind of core of the mystery schools, which is when they set up the public mystery schools, Theosophy, Anthroposophy, the Cayce work, Gurdjieff's work, and Gurdjieff gets into Atlantis, Gurdjieff gets into UFOs. It's interesting, in Beelzebub, tales to his grandson, Beelzebub's going all through our solar system in what? In a spaceship. And he comes down and visits Atlantis a few times. So he has all these interesting observations. Beelzebub's tales to his grandson is probably like the Ulysses of esoteric literature, because it's very hard to decode, but there's something powerful and something fascinating in there. Not to mention a few mentions of our friend Rudolf Steiner, who comes up tonight also talking about Atlantean airships. And it's interesting because there's another piece tonight, which a lot of people aren't aware of, but Cayce, when he was around and doing his reading, it was previous to the UFO wave, so those questions didn't come up. However, there are several different occasions where he offered information about UFOs. And some of those cross over into the Atlantean technology, such as his comments about Ezekiel. Some of those cross over directly, and I mean unmistakably, into off-world visitors. And then there's another question about outer spheres and what he's referring to exactly. So we get all different realms along with elementals in the Cayce work. And I have to say, the Cayce work in terms of Atlantis, there's nothing, in my opinion, it's those 30 years of readings, and it's the 900 life readings that mention Atlantis. There's nothing that comes close in terms of detail, in terms of scope, in terms of day-to-day understanding about the Atlantis subject. And it relies, it harkens back to Plato's story, and it harkens back to these other aspects. And for me, I've read Steiner's information, Cosmic Memory. Steiner understands the whole primordial development better than anybody, and he lays that out. And he gets into Atlantis, he gets into Lemuria. Those books are fascinating. They still are the most riveting books. Some of the earlier attempts around Atlantis on the theosophical side are interesting, such as when Blavatsky includes it. When Scott Elliott does a book on it, it's big in theosophical circles, and it's early. I think it's 1885 or somewhere in there, right after Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, by Ignatius Donnelly, who is a VP candidate. So there's something going on in the American underground, the mystery schools, where we have Theosophy, we have a VP candidate who's writing Atlantis books. We have the setup for all that spiritualism that hit a decade earlier. So if you go from about Lincoln's presidency right up through the 1890s, you've got this incredible wave. And we know that this is the war of the mystery schools that takes place. And suddenly, by the end of the 19th century, you're sitting there with the Golden Dawn and Theosophy and Anthroposophy and all these different schools of thought dealing with the mystery aspect, and that Rosicrucian wave coming again through Anthroposophy. So all that stuff was set up and staged for us. They go through a number of processes. And here we are coming back. As it was predicted by Steiner, that we would come back around, and that he predicted this in 1920. It's interesting because he was very disappointed that World War I had happened. And he said, in fact, that Anthroposophy, the mystery schools, have failed. But he said there's going to be another opportunity, and it's going to come back in a wave. And that wave will hit in 2020. And this is the beginning of that period that we're in. So we have another opportunity here with the mystery knowledge to open some of those doors. And you can see with a lot of the half steps in between, everything from Elizabeth Clare Prophet's work to Alice Bailey and all these things that happened, they were attempts to continue on. And it's when the mystery schools withdraw and things happen on their own. This is an interesting process that takes place. There's ups and downs to it. But in any case, those were, different viable efforts, but they didn't seem to have the potency of the original Blavatsky breakthrough and the original Steiner breakthrough. One of the things that Rudolf Steiner quoted in relation to all this was that Blavatsky, at the foundation of Theosophy, at its cradle, stood true initiators. That's a very important statement because Steiner doesn't hand out those kind of compliments easy when it comes to these things. So we know there's a genuine mystery impulse. And in Cayce's work, when he refers to Blavatsky, he says about the secret doctrine, basically nothing had ever been released like that. So they acknowledge it. And then Blavatsky is under so much pressure, and she's under eventually psychic attack and psychic imprisonment, that she goes off the rails on the eastern side. And the threads have to be picked up by others. And the Western kind of thrust of that Western esoteric tradition comes back in through anthroposophy. Always have to remember that Steiner for a decade came through Theosophy. So Theosophy is the major breakthrough, and everything kind of spins off out of that. And suddenly the introduction in America, which is crucial, reincarnation, yoga, meditation, cremation, all of these different things come directly out of that theosophical wave, psychic experience, life after death. These things, through spiritualism had bubbled up, but they found their true voice in Helena Blavatsky. Now, what I'm going to start off with tonight on the Atlantean UFO side, this is crucial because, one, they had the technology in Atlantean times that we refer to as the UFO file now. The question is, how much of the modern UFO file is actually that technology in this period, rediscovered, reanimated, or kept in perpetuity by some group? This is very important, and there are stories that are very compelling that will give us some idea that maybe somebody kept this technology over the period of time of thousands of years through these mystery school secret traditions. That's what we're going to get into tonight. It's great to have so many of you here with us. Before we go any further, Miss Olivia, you're up.
This is a great question. Jim Gerard, are you familiar with Germany NIMSA 1850 builders of airships? Do they come up tonight?
Well, the NIMSA thing, we've done shows on them. And of course, they're a very important aspect because it has to do with the whole 19th century airship mystery. Tonight's very focused on the Atlantis period with UFOs. And but we've been talking about having Bosley back on to do a NIMSA show because NIMSA is something, it was ferreted out from Bosley's work, and Bosley did a great job on the Sonora Arrows Club. This is something where I think he brought a good wave of that up. And now there were all kinds of airship investigations, including Jim Mars did a fantastic investigation of that period. But if you get into the Del Show thing, which I did bring up on Alex's show, it is stunning because there he is from this airship club, and he comes over from Germany to California, and just through some ridiculous luck, we find all of his paintings. But he was a major bigwig in that aerospace club. And in the middle of those paintings, we find this airship thing, and then there's a train, and then there's a Trump in the middle of that. So, and the series of artwork was 45, which was the president. Trump was the 45th president of the U.S. So it's an incredible and bizarre coincidence of circumstances. Let's face it. I mean, that's not, it's predictive, and it makes you wonder again, because then we know these connections with Trump and the aerospace groups and his uncle, et cetera, as we've laid out on this program. So I don't think that that's by accident that there's a Trump there operating in the middle of those early aerospace groups. And the aero clubs were way out in front of the Wright brothers. As a matter of fact, the Cosmos Club, which we've covered on a few programs, and I still want to do a lot more with them, but this is a very important group. And it was funny because when we were doing the episodes and bringing it up, John Warner came on the show, and John Warner the Fourth, and he's the son of Senator Warner, and he is the cousin of Chris Mellon. He's put a lot of incredible things on the record about the Mellon family, of which he is a part. And he went really deep on this aspect. And for me, I think it's very important that we have those people in the background who really understand the subject matter quite well. What else you got?
Steve Vaughn says the letter X is highly prominent in A Dweller on Two Planets. Look at the book glossary. X before and after many nouns.
Wow. Well, we are going to go deep on the Dweller on Two Planets tonight, and I'm going to ask Philos the Tibetan to come and help us, because he seems to have, he's one of those interesting spirits that can pop in like that. But you're 100% right that there's X steganography throughout the book. That's one example of it. And he makes an interesting point about crosses and how in esoteric terms, the crosses on the edge are always left open. So the ends of the cross are always open. And then the X steganography in the back is undeniable. There's a few kind of odd things I want to start off with, if you'll indulge me on this. One of them is the fact that Philos mentions someone being the reincarnation of a great scientist from Atlantis. Now, remember, this book was written in 1886. It's released in 1899, and there's a story behind that as well, which I'll get into. And Frederick Oliver is the author, and it's interesting because years later, a researcher went deep and found out that his family was very, very into kind of mystical interpretations of the Virgin Mary. So when he starts to channel, at a very young age, 16 years old, he has this spirit talking to him, and it develops into a gigantic interaction, which over the course of a year and a half becomes The Dweller on Two Planets, which is the book. So it's originally written in 1886. But there's a character that he brings up, like I said, and there's a lot of very unusual things about this character because he's such a giant in early mathematics of the 19th century. And this is Zara Colburn. Now, Zara Colburn is an unusual genius.
I love that picture.
Math genius.
Look at the little feet.
Yes, exactly. He's a very unusual child. He's a gifted child. He's from Vermont. And interestingly enough, he would go on to teach there at the same university that I studied at up in Norwich. And it's interesting because he has a very unusual story in that when he's 5, it's discovered, and his dad's a farmer and stuff, and he comes from very, very humble beginnings, but it's discovered that he's this incredible math genius. Now, he's identified by Philos saying that, this is a great incarnation of an Atlantean scientist. And so I became curious that Philos would bring him up, and I wondered about it a little bit. So I did some digging on his background, and just a few odd things jumped out at me. One of them is the fact that, get ready, Zara had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. So it's polydactyl. I think that's the way they say that. And you can actually see in the picture, if you look at his left hand, that he has an extra finger going on there. There's something very interesting about that, I think.
I love the comments. Space Ghost says 6 fingers is a giant trait.
That's true.
Mad Dog says Anunnaki. Nephilim.
Well, it's interesting too because there are some readings that Cayce does about this Prince Mu that has to do with this city in the Gobi Desert, the city of gold, and he is blue and has 6 fingers. So there's something unusual about this trait. But there's a few facts here. And he wrote his own memoir at the end of his life, thank God. But what it says is the memoir is quite difficult to search through because Colburn only now and then gives dates. The first thing I therefore noticed was the earliest likeness of Colburn was made in 1810 or 1811 when he was only 6 by Rembrandt Peale in Philadelphia. The most well-known likeness of Colburn was made in early 1813 when he was 8 years old. The drawing was made by Thomas Hull, and that's the one that we were showing. So it's interesting. Colburn had inherited his 12 fingers and 12 toes from his father. Now, Colburn's polydactyly is certain against the contest. It is certain that the contest was held in 1813. Hamilton wrote to his sister Eliza about meeting Colburn again in 1820. He's greatly grown and much improved in manner. He's lost every trace of his 6th finger. So apparently they removed it once he got in the public eye. But I found all that unusual, and I also found the complex problems he was able to solve. All of these mathematicians at MIT go back and refer to him over and over again, even now. So this child prodigy was really quite something else. Interestingly enough, John Hancock took an interest in him and said, we need to really invest in him and bring him to DC and do all these incredible things. Oh, I'm sorry, John Quincy Adams. And what happens is the father turns it down and doesn't educate him, but takes him on this tour of Europe. And it almost becomes a little bit of like a circus in a way. And so this was maybe not such a good way to handle this. After leaving Boston, his father exhibited Zara for money throughout the middle and part of the south of Europe. January 1812, he sailed to England, and then Colburn was being exhibited in Dublin and for his mental arithmetic abilities. After traveling to England, Scotland, and Ireland, he spent 18 months in Paris. And then the father hits on hard times because he can't figure out what to do with him. He's not a good business manager, and he starts to dress him up, and he's like, "Hey, you're a Shakespeare actor now." So he's doing everything with this guy. It's like, "Now you're a musician. Here's a lute," And he really kind of runs it down. And then the father dies of pneumonia. Zara comes back, and his family doesn't recognize him because he's all grown up.
I thought it was tuberculosis.
Well, he has pneumonia, and then maybe he does actually die of TB. I think you're right.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens is he comes back, and the family doesn't recognize him. I found that weird too. The mother doesn't recognize her own son. It has been, 6 or 7 years, but this seems extraordinary to me. So the whole story is unusual, and it just sits there as this side thing going on in A Dweller on Two Planets with our friend. But I think there might be hints in this book that there's something a little more going on in this unusual story of Zara Colburn. So more to be found on that. Let's get into Dweller on Two Planets and our friend Philos. This is Philos the Tibetan. Now, Philos, I'll actually read this kind of setup, which gives us something of an idea. In the 1880s, a Siskiyou County, California resident named Frederick Spencer Oliver wrote A Dweller on Two Planets, or The Dividing of the Way, which described a secret city inside of Mount Shasta. Now, spoiler alert here, in a couple of weeks, we have a show on Mount Shasta coming up. So there's this is kind of an interesting prelude to it. In passing, he mentioned Lemuria, but the book is generally about Atlantis. Edgar Lucian Larkin, a writer and astronomer, wrote in 1813 an article in which he reviewed the Oliver book. In 1925, a writer by the name of Selvius wrote Descendants of Lemuria, a description of ancient cults in America, which was published in 1925. Selvius reported that Larkin had seen the Lemurian village through a telescope. The Lemurian lost continent of the Pacific, in which the Selvius material appeared, the Mount Shasta legend has developed into one of the Mount Shasta's most prominent legends. The entries in this section document the books and articles about Mount Shasta and its Lemurians. Like I mentioned, Spencer Oliver had a family that was very into the Virgin Mary, and this may have opened up some kind of a way for him to be a channel. And there's just a little mention here. The book discusses the publishing history of the Oliver manuscript, replete with appearance of Philos the Tibetan after the death of Oliver. Mother Mary was part of a tradition of people associated with Frederick Spencer Oliver, and the book contains essays by Oliver himself. Now, Philos is a disembodied master who is telling about all the things that he did when he lived in Atlantis. Now, what's unusual about this story is written in 1886. It gives us an incredible backdrop of the Atlantean flying machines. Now, think about this. Flight, the Wright brothers' flight, was off in 1903, waiting to come in. By the way, that's the signature of Philos in Atlantean characters, supposedly. So here we have in 1886 this book being written, and it includes all of these references to these Atlantean flying machines, but better than that, it includes sketches of them. Now, we can imagine that, things like Jules Verne, there are things around this kind of sci-fi angle, H.G. Wells, etc. But this has really taken it to an interesting place. Here is what they called the Veil X, which is the name of the ship. And if that doesn't look like a traditional cigar-shaped UFO, I don't know what does. That's quite remarkable. And when you get into the book a little bit, some of the descriptions of the Atlantean technology, I think, are very advanced, and they will come up again, including the use of this term nightside, which the Cayce readings will pick up on heavily, which Steiner will reference, and which Philos says is an alchemical term. It's long been a matter of interest to me to learn all I could on this band of nature students, the Inkeles, as they were sometimes called, from Inkel. Thousands of years later, in the time of Jesus of Nazareth, these were called the Essenes. And what's going on here is Philos is saying in America, there was a group called Incal, which is just like Inca, except there's no L in
So
Inca.
it's spelled the same way.
It's exactly the same, I-N-C-A-L. And what's interesting is he's saying the lineage of this group becomes the mystery school, the Essenes. Now, Cayce will go into deep subject matter level on this, and he will say the Dead Sea Scrolls and all these things are going to be found, and they were found in 1947. Cayce went into great detail and said there were women who were part of the Essenes, and one of the women, Judy, actually was advanced in astronomy. She was advanced in astrological studies, numerological studies, and taught Jesus astral projection. Now, Judy is not mentioned in the Bible, so this is a complete piece that Cayce is giving out there, but he says that the Essenes are a very mystical group, and their whole name means expectancy. They are working in very mystical terms to help create the circumstances so that Christ can enter. So they're a Christian mystery school. Interestingly enough, if you go deep into this topic, you're going to find that the entire Essene history that Cayce lays out didn't exist anywhere. And when they find those scrolls 2 years after Cayce's death, they confirm everything that he said about the desert culture, including the fact that they included women, which was the Pharisees, can you imagine groups like that doing that? Or the Romans or something? No way. But here the Essenes have these high priestesses. Now that's also an echo back to Atlantis, because in Atlantis, everything was done through the priestesses. Now, what's interesting is he goes a little bit further, and he uses the term Poseidia a lot. He gives a great description of Poseidia, which, again, Cayce will say, this is the cream of the crop of the Atlanteans. This is the Amelius group. This is the Law of One people. They are, initiates, basically. And so it's the best that Atlantis has to offer. That group will set themselves up in the hot zone as the last bastion of Atlantis before everything goes down. And so much of the unusual activity of the Hall of Records and all the rest of it, the fact that we have two Hall of Records in a very short proximity, one in Bimini and one in Yucatan, shows us that this incredible Poseidon group was down there. So he's going on a little bit further, and he says, uh, he's speaking to one of these other masters who are giving him information. And he says, it still grew still more when Ra remarked later on that the girl Anzumi would one day be an Inkle. Now, Anzumi is part of this story, which is she's this mystical woman in this story, and Philos, is in love with her. And what's weird is in the middle of this book, there's kind of like this tragic romance thing that happens. And inside of it, we get all of these details about Atlantis. So I almost think that someone was working with like a novella type structure in order to get these details out, because at a certain point, you know, when he's lost his love and all the rest of it, he walks into what sounds like a subway and picks up one of these Atlantean crafts. And then he's like, you know, flying along like he's driving down the highway, heartbroken. It's very unusual, the mix there of this 18th century kind of, you know, almost Dickens type literature, and then the fact that we're dealing with very deep esoteric subjects. So I'm going to read a little more from this. During all this time, I've not been permitted nor able to have the book published. In the interval, many of the things spoke of the shape of scientific and mechanical rediscoveries spoken of in the book have been brought to pass. This is the author, Oliver, writing about releasing the book, because he wrote it in 1886. He tried to get it out. It didn't happen. And Philos pressed on him, you got to make this happen. Do it. It'll come together. In 1899, the book comes out. But the fact that he wrote it in 1886 and that there were copies, early copies, is well established. So there's a period of time in there where it just doesn't hit. The high attainments of the Atlanteans, lost for thousands of years following the result of the engulfment of their great continent, have been and are rapidly being brought to light in utility, bearing out the prediction of the author. Witness the discovery recently of the X-ray, not even dreamed of in 1886. Yet in the book, you will find a long treatise concerning cathodicity and the amazing powers of the night side of nature, of such practical use to and so well understood by the people of that wonderful age. Also note wireless telegraphy. It too is herein scattered all through and referred to in this book, precluding the possibility of interpolation. Again, regarding there being but one energy and one substance, now beginning to find able champions and general scientific acceptance in place of passing in it as a chimera for the elementary hypothesis so long held by chemists. These are but major examples of what was set forth in A Dweller on Two Planets in 1886, together with many more predictions of the immediate oncoming of what the author terms rediscovery of the secrets buried with Atlantis. And it is promised that we, as Atlanteans returning, are going beyond her fallen greatness. And that by slow synthetic steps, we are coming up to surpass even those wonderful attainments as the ever expanding and growing mind and soul of man climbs ever higher in evolution. To all earnest, though perhaps skeptical inquirers, I may say that the evidence as to this book being finished in 1886, and he goes on for certain. And the author he's referring to there is Philos, because the setup basically is that Philos continues. This kid is in high school and he's 15, 16. And by the time he writes it, he's 18. But he's being visited and impressed upon and doing automatic writing and things. And Philos is giving him the message of all this. Now, there were spiritualists and there were other things of this nature around in that period. However, I think we have to say for certain that the information that comes out is so prescient in relation to Atlantis and what we will discover later. And the fact that some of the themes jibe with Steiner's work and Cayce's work, which come out later, decades later, then we have to kind of arrive at the point of saying there's something interesting about Philos. As a matter of fact, there is a Cayce reading about Philos and the information contained in the book, and some interesting and odd answers I'm going to share on that as well. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is the X Series 148 episode, and here we go. It is UFOs of the Atlantean variety, the Atlantean kind, and the Nightside forces. We're going to be taking your questions in the second part of tonight's program as well. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Corporal Salty says, I heard that Autech Naval Research was chosen to be in that location due to a sunken, he doesn't finish it, but I think Atlantean ruin, right?
Interesting. Well, Autech, as we know, is on Andros Island. And Andros, they have this thing called the Andros platform, and it's close by. The whole thing is very close to Bimini. And the idea is a number of researchers have gone there and seen ruins around Andros, just like around Bimini. And that is the kind of remnants of Poseidia, as it were. Now, there's a few things that happen that made me go directly into some of that Cayce database and find references to Nightside. It's always come up in the Cayce work, and but I wanted to see if there were any readings I'd missed on it. There were a couple. So I'm going to read some of these now. And it's very interesting because you could say that Cayce, in bringing forward the Atlantis subject in his readings, he is fulfilling part of what a Dweller on Two Planets brings forward. Now, at the end of Dweller on Two Planets, there's almost an apocalyptic prediction. Because remember, Philos had gone through Atlantis, and so he knew about it. And they asked Cayce, is this going to happen? Like, is his prediction accurate? And what Cayce says basically is like, well, it's true for Philos, but it doesn't have anything to do with what might actually happen. And so, it's his input. But they ask him, well, what do you think about Philos and the whole thing? And the reading says, in this very kind of non-interference way, this is Philos laying out, it depends on if it jives with your own conscience, basically. Like, it's up to you what you want to think of Philos, but he does not dismiss Philos by any stretch of the imagination. What's interesting is if you look deep enough, you can find Cayce commenting on Ouspensky, Blavatsky, and Steiner and Philos. So that's an incredible, kind of an important interface, I would say. You can find Gurdjieff commenting on Steiner. You can find Ouspensky commenting on Steiner. As a matter of fact, it's interesting because both Ouspensky and J.G. Bennett were going to be disciples of Steiner before they became disciples of Gurdjieff. So, there were just a lot of powerhouses around in this period.
Can I throw you a
early
question
20th century?
on that? Do you think they regretted that choice?
No, because they had to bring forward, they had to bring forward this other track. And, but it seems like all of the groups, there's some kind of, there's an incredible effort, but there seems to be some kind of something blocking the full establishment of these groups. And I think in Theosophy's case, it had an incredible period, incredible spike, and then it hits very hard and crashes very hard when Krishnamurti, when they try to make Krishnamurti kind of carry the Christ and all that. And Krishnamurti basically says, I can't do this, like I am a very deep spiritual person, but I can't carry out your vision to Besant and Ledbetter in the order of the star. Well, the problem with aspects of Theosophy is they wanted to force the culture to move forward. And you can appreciate it. And we all want things to move quickly. But with them, they were like, well, let's get Lord Maitreya, Christ, to occupy Krishnamurti. And Steiner, that's when Steiner throws Theosophy out and says, we have to go on a different track. But the setup for Theosophy is so powerful and it's so important. And then Anthroposophy, Steiner does so many things with it. He increases our knowledge with the books, but he himself is disappointed that World War I happens because he thought on bringing forward the spiritual science, the culture will pick up on it. So there are things. And at the very end of his life, in 1924, he's looking at ways of reincorporating Anthroposophy so it's a different kind of organization. So I find that interesting as well, as if he doesn't like it, he didn't want it to be an institution. The mystery schools don't work in perpetuity as these establishments and these foundations. What they do, this is something that Gurdjieff mentioned to Bennett, they are there to spread seeds, and then they release the seeds, and then they withdraw, and then the seeds sprout into all these kind of wild things, and then they come back in and assist them. This is how the groups work. It's not like we're supposed to have, a endless Gurdjieff University or something of this nature. But the public schools, I think, do help because it gives us the ability to develop that magnetic center. Good question, though. My goodness. Nightside. Are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
Cayce has a number of references to this. There's a crisscross in Philos, the Tibetan dweller on two planets. But let's go with Cayce on this. Going back in time, again, looking at those Atlantean readings, going back into that period where the Atlanteans, as Poseidia, were developing the two-eye stone for very spiritual purposes. And the two-eye stone being the crystal that will eventually run the entire culture with the high technology. This is from Cayce reading 195. How would one explain the differentiation between time in night and day? And Cayce says, how would one explain the differentiation in the activity of forces when there is a vibratory force set in cellular force, and one is set in an oval or oblong force, which perpetrates and penetrates that force, which produces a generating force, as in its activity, in a negative force, as is seen in what has ordinarily been called alchemy. This is called night side. That is, a positive force is that as of the active force in its action. Do you see? I don't know if the person saw, but Cayce continued to talk about night side forces. Here we go. In the one before this incarnation, we find in that period known as the Atlantean, the entity then among those peoples who gained much understanding of the application of the night side of life, or of negative influences in the Earth's sphere, of those who gave much understanding in the manner of transmission of sound, voice, picture, and such to the peoples in the period, using same to self's own destruction. For the entity gained a high position during this experience and ruled with unlimited power, yet to self's own undoing. So they exercise the power of the night side forces, and they project the transmission of sound, voice, and picture. They become incredibly huge. And it's almost like, they exemplify their ego in this sense. They become something so huge, and then it's their undoing. Over and over again, the different applications of the night side force, whether it's communications, this transmission of sound and voice. I mean, basically, it almost sounds like a political leader that's transmitting through television. And then we also find it used in technological aspects. And then that is to their undoing. Over and over again, the night side and drawing on it unravels things. We can get into it if we understand there's a technological side on one hand and there's an occult piece on the other. Here we go again. In the one before this, we find the land known as Atlantis. This entity was then one of the Poseidians, and gaining in reputation to the abilities of the entity through the adornment of body using night side of the influences in the Earth's plane. This brought destructive forces to self and through the misapplication of power. Now, here's night side being used in the adornment of the body. This is really fascinating. So the adornment of the body, somehow you can use the same atomic force that you would use, for example, to create these airships, to use on the crystals, or to use in projecting something like television. So he actually mentions television in 1930 before it's really got off the ground. It's discovered in 1926, but nobody has a TV in 1930. In the one before this, we find in that land known as Atlantis. The entity was then of the Poseidians, and in the name of Al-Ar was the ruler of those forces of the Law of One, this is the Emilius group, and those activities that were raised against this entity's activities by the Beelzebubs. It's quite a group. Well, this is the sons of Belial. This makes for an influence in the physical forces of the entity at present. Not that this may not be made right if the entity as then will not be turned aside, irrespective of what happens. For in those days, the entity saw in those mighty upheavals and the destructive forces used for the people from the prisms activities and from the fires that were started for the fires of the deeper inferno, as from nature's storehouse itself. So this is another nightside reading where this person is part of the destruction. They're tapping into this nightside force. They're using it, and in this case, it's for the development of weapons. I'm going to do a few more of these. Now, earlier I mentioned that there are Cayce readings which explicitly outline that some of these UFOs that are coming in are visitors from off-world. So let's get this one on the board. The entity was among the priestesses of the Mayan experience. It was just before the period when those of the East had come, and there were beginnings of unfoldments of the understandings that there were other portions of the same land, or those that were visiting from other worlds or planets. So it's interesting, too, because he's saying, well, they're coming in, all these people are coming in from the East. That's the Atlantean egress. And then this person who's a priestess becomes aware of them, and then somehow in that loop with them are these visitors from other planets. Now, this, it represents an interesting twist in the middle of all this, because there are rumors that the Atlanteans were somehow interacting with some group that was outside of our regular evolution, so outside of human evolution. And here we have him saying that they're coming in from other worlds. Okay, here's another one that maybe starts to get into the airships and gives us an idea of what the Atlantean UFOs were all about. In the one before this, we find in the land known as Atlantis, during this period when many peoples understood the laws of universal forces, the entity was among those able to carry the messages through space to other lands. He was the guider of crafts of that period, hence the mechanical side and the mystery side of many conditions influenced this entity. In this period, the entity lost in Atlantis, for there was the misapplication of many of the forces and the powers understood. And the name was Amexel. And the person asks him, what is the true significance of a visit in my childhood from a member of the White Brotherhood? And later the revelations of my mystical experience. So this guy thinks someone from the White Brotherhood visited him, and Cayce doesn't skip a beat. Cayce says, is it any wonder from the experiences through which this entity, as Joel, passed? Then there needs to be that you turn to within yourself as the promise that he will meet thee, and the body is the temple. Now, he's giving him that kind of spiritual input. And he's basically saying, yeah, the White Brotherhood met you for a reason. And these references to the White Brotherhood are very important because the White Brotherhood being sort of the ultimate mystery school, and this is a group that is associated with moving the entire world evolution forward. And so, they operate there in the background, moving everything. And this is a reference to them, because they actually personify and embody physically at times. And that's an important piece for us to remember as we look at the UFO thing. Remember a lot of those UFOs that we see, the interesting kind of apotheum quality that they have is these pilots say, well, I'm looking right through it, actually. This is something that happened during the Phoenix Lights when it was blocking out the stars and everything. People are like, oh, wait, some of it I can see through. So, it's here and it's not here. And this becomes maybe a difficult question to settle just by regular science. That's what we're going to get into in looking at this. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist X Series 148. We're going deep tonight. This is Atlantean UFOs and the Nightside Forces. We're going to be taking your questions in the part 2 of tonight. And but we're going to do maybe another 45 minutes on this first. And before I go any further, Olivia.
Deb Eddy says Nightside equals dark energy being harvested at CERN. Is there any CERN connection?
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, it's interesting because when you bring it into the 21st century or even the 20th century, you start to see the particle colliders, the rediscovery of how to open these things up and tap into them. And CERN being right in the heart, because we know that there's a supernatural aspect involved with that also. And there's a weapon use as well. So it's something for us to keep in mind. But yeah, you're on the right track. You're on the right trolley.
Okay, another.
Yes.
Dave Tormina says, interesting how the boy who discovered television was also named Philo Farnsworth.
That's true.
His biography was also written by Shatskin, the same author behind Defying Gravity on Thomas Townsend Brown.
Interesting. Yes. And his story, I think, is unusual. And it's kind of fascinating if you look at it because the Germans were like, ooh, we want everything that, that you've got on this. And they end up adopting television before anyone. As a matter of fact, the 1936 Olympics are televised in Germany. And we don't get traditional television in America till 1950. So again, we have that kind of German edge, the German edge in rocketry and electronics and there in television, even though Farnsworth is one of our guys. That's Cayce, by the way, in his studio that I was showing there, because remember, Cayce was a photographer, is what he did. And when he wasn't giving psychic readings, he was hanging out in his photography studio. And there's a book I got. It's kind of rare now, I guess, but I'm lucky I have it, which is they sell it at the ARE, or they used to. And it's Edgar Cayce as a photographer. And those pictures are all really quite good. Cayce on that little couch right there would stretch out and be given instructions to go into trance. He'd actually do a kind of a self-trance, and then they could ask him questions. And it's interesting because I was going through a history that Gladys Davis wrote about knowing Cayce and all the experiences. And what I didn't know until I listened to one of her last interviews was that Cayce, before he went into the reading, would breathe heavily. And the way that she did it sounded very intense. So, you picture Cayce, oh, I'm going to sleep, whatever. Well, he gets to a certain point and then he goes into like this very heavy breathing and then he's in the trance. So that's where the body, the other body is leaving. And it's a fascinating point too, that he learned this ability because he was shot by an arrow in another life and he was in the desert and he willed himself out of his body. And by doing that, he developed, when he came back in this lifetime as Cayce, it was easier for him to do this astral projection piece. And of course, Cayce in his own histories had that very mystical set of lives back in Egypt and Atlantis. But I think that this is an interesting little tidbit. It might have given him an unusual ability there in the background. So the readings claimed. I want to bring this up because I showed earlier Philos and his cigar-shaped UFO, and I have a series of those. There's a lot of Atlantean UFOs to show you tonight. Edgar Cayce had a dream, and this is the reading that was given on the dream. But here's the dream first. I've been born again in 2100 AD in Nebraska. The sea apparently covered all of the western part of the country, as the city where I lived was on the coast. The family name was a strange one. At an early age, as a child, I declared myself to be Edgar Cayce, who had lived 200 years before. Scientists, men with long beards, little hair, and thick glasses, were called in to observe me. They decided to visit the places where I said I had been born, lived, and worked: in Kentucky, Alabama, New York, Michigan, Virginia Beach. Taking me with them, the group of scientists visited these places in long cigar-shaped metal flying ships, which moved along at high speed. Now that alone is a snapshot of the UFO phenomena. And here is Cayce in the 1930s relating this dream where a cigar-shaped metal flying ship is moving along at high speed. And he goes further. Water-covered part of Alabama, Norfolk, Virginia, had become an immense seaport. New York had been destroyed either by war or an earthquake and was being rebuilt. Industries were scattered over the countryside. Most of the houses were made of glass. So there's some solar piece coming in there that he's seeing, I think. And he says the group returned to Nebraska, taking the records with them to study. So here's Casey's dream about a future incarnation and that kind of heavily reshaped map of the world going on in America with Nebraska on the coast. Think about that. So we're tapping into something there. That's going to be a hard one for us to figure out. But it's interesting because the Earth Changes piece of the Cayce readings is a thread there, and it's a thread in the mystery school knowledge. And it's hard to imagine. A lot of people projected things, I think, into the Cayce readings. They were like, this is the period when it's going to happen, when they were writing in the 1970s and things. But if you go deep, he says it's a gradual activity in humanity for the poles to shift, not a cataclysmic one. And he's talking about these things taking place over a period of time. However, it does seem like we will see a lot of them in this century for sure. And some of them may be happening as we speak. In terms of land rising, this is a crucial aspect because with the land rising, the original land that was Atlantis that sank rises and reminds us all, aha, we have that whole amnesia thing is lifting and we remember this whole piece of history. That's crucial. Okay, a little more on the Cayce readings, and then we're going to jump to Steiner and the UFO phenomena. Now, okay, there's one in particular I'm looking for. Bear with me. If you got something, Miss Olivia, I'll take it.
Fruber Fighter has a good comment. If we could extrapolate from the recent conversation with Joseph Farrell, you would think that an intelligent universe would isolate Earth more if CERN was employed than otherwise.
I don't know about intelligent universe in that sense because there's a chaos factor, which is part of creation. And so it's hard to say, there's all this stuff about, well, this wouldn't be allowed to happen, this kind of thing. But so much of it is about us and what we do. I think we find that in the Cayce readings a lot. He talks about how certain things won't happen, like earthquakes or destruction or invasion by war, if certain groups are together, working towards that. That is kind of mentally projecting a different reality. So we don't know our own powers in this sense. Another thing that Cayce suggested was, well, is all of this basically, the sunspots that we see, is that our own kind of greed, our own miscommunications with each other, and then it becomes projected out like that. Cayce does this a lot. He sees us as controlling the physical environment much more than we're aware of, and that's a very Atlantean kind of a trait.
One more question on that?
Yes.
So is the chaos factor necessary for our soul growth, for the purpose
There's
of
no
incarnating?
question that even in the Bible, there's the whole thing about humanity brings order out of chaos. So the chaos factor is there, so you have all the ingredients for creation, but you need to guide it, or else you get, a very chaotic universe with, things like discovery of the atomic bomb and things of this nature. So with the technology era that we're moving into, we're so far beyond the things that we've, our parents and grandparents dealt with. This is a period, an ultimate Atlantean period. And when we get into Cayce's readings around the things and the development of these cyborgs, sometimes using animal parts and things of this nature, and projecting a kind of a human soul into these controlled entities, like creating clones and things of this nature, we're dealing with interrupting the evolutionary track directly. And that is a real major problem in all the discoveries that we're making. So this is where the mystery schools can guide us towards something better. They talk about, let's take a pause on AI and all this stuff. Look, the development of the technology goes back a long time ago. And the idea that, we're just getting ahead of ourselves, they're 50 years ahead of us. So they already know it. So Elon Musk warning about AI and all this kind of stuff is sort of a joke because they already have it and they already are using it. So I think more that is a kind of a soap opera going on. It's a little bit of theater about we're going to set limits now to what goes on, and as if there's some kind of benevolent guidance council. What's happened, in fact, is the leadership has taken us over the waterfall and off the cliff. And if anything, the quicker that we can get up on the level that they're at by understanding things like the advanced technology and the types of things we're going into here, I think the better for the culture in general, because that's part of the problem, which is part of the schizophrenia comes from the fact that they've learned so much about the UFO file and left the public out. They've learned so much about space. They've learned so much about, particle colliders and the Hadron Collider and these things. And the public is given a very scant version of this thing. So, the faster that we can independently get up on that same level with them and that whole song and dance doesn't work, the better, because the leadership is not reflective of humanity right now, in my opinion. The leadership's so backward that we didn't improve the leadership as we went along. It completely degenerated. So that's where you get Bezos and Zuckerberg and this whole wave of thing. These are people that are very undeveloped and greedy. Greedy Gretchen.
One more?
Yes.
MG, the secret doctrine tells an Atlantean episode where the Black brothers get their UFOs stolen by the white side so they cannot escape a coming flood.
That's true. Oh, you took the words right out of my mouth. There's a little sideshow in here, and it has to do with a couple of half steps that happened in the 20th century. And then I'm going to jump back to Steiner's early 20th century. But this is Daniel Fry in a place called Merlin, Oregon. And he takes this picture of this craft. Now, this craft looks to me like an early Nazi development type craft, and not a traditional high-end UFO. But the thing is hovering, and it's not utilizing, jet propulsion. That's for sure. It's got a different kind of technology that's operational. This is another one of his from that period. Fry is interesting. Okay, there's a story about, this is a guy who worked at Aerojet, which is an advanced aerospace group. And when he leaves, he's working at this kind of secret facility, and he's in the desert, and he's planning to drive to some festival, and he sees a large UFO, and then it starts to communicate with him. Now, however people regard the story of Fry, he was very deep with a lot of the kind of heavy thinkers of the period. But whatever one thinks of Fry and his story, listen to the unusual threads of lost civilization technology in his exchange with this person he calls Alan, who's on board this craft. Alan says to him after they get to know each other, I'm skipping way ahead, of course, these are things which I had hoped to put off until our next contact. I was thinking I have a picture of our friend here. There's so much to tell you in so little time. Our ancestors came originally from this earth. They had built a great empire and a mighty science upon the continent, which your legends call Mu. At the same time, there was a great empire upon the continent of Atlantis. There was a rivalry in science, friendly at first, but becoming bitter with the years, as each nation flaunted its achievements in the face of the other. In a few centuries, their science had passed the point of development which exists here now. Not content with releasing a few crumbs and the binding energy of the atom, as your physicists are doing now, they'd learned to rotate the entire masses upon the energy axis. Under the circumstances, it was inevitable that the two nations should eventually destroy each other, just as the two major nations in the earth today are preparing to do so. Now, the encounter is 1964. But the discussion must wait until we return. Our time is more than up. Already it is requiring too much energy to keep our ship in its present position. And so he goes, like a person walking in his sleep, I stepped down on the floor to the craft and stumbled a dozen places through the sand before turning to look back. The door had closed behind me, and as I turned, a horizontal band of orange-colored light appeared about the central part of the ship, and it leaped upward as though it had been released from a catapult. And what's interesting is he's given all along in this interaction with these advanced beings and their advanced craft that we actually came originally from Lemuria, and we took off, and now we're coming back. That's the story. Now, Fry there with Adamski, there's a weird thing there with Adamski because he's working in the background with the same scientist who's working with T.T. Brown. There's a picture of T.T. Brown leaning up against a tube with one of those Adamski UFOs in oil. It's like a weird scale model of the thing. So something strange is going on. They were trying to figure out what was happening with that. But there they are talking directly about Atlantis in this UFO encounter. And Fry will be one of those guys who's around for 10 or 20 years and then goes off and does something else. But for me, there's a weird crisscross about Atlantis going on in this period. And Adamski himself, if you go a little further, of course, this is the guy who encounters Orthon in the desert, and he really sets off the UFO craze in 1950. His book is actually put out in the same book with the top theosophist in England. And he's teaching, if you go back into the 40s, he's teaching all about theosophy. He's a theosophy teacher. So here we have, again, that public mystery knowledge getting wrapped up before the UFO wave hits. And then the people who are on the scene, George Hunt Williamson, Adamski, and all the rest, they come directly out of that mystery school tradition. There's something unusual about that, no matter how it ends up. And on the kind of darker negative side, you could say, by the same token, L. Ron Hubbard comes out of that tradition. But he's coming out of the Crowley Secret Society left-hand path mystery school tradition. So inevitably, what we get is a UFO wave on one hand and Scientology on the other, which encapsulates a whole alien philosophy. And it's interesting. I'm going to save the Scientology discussion for when Gigi Young joins us next time, because she has some very powerful information on that as well. All right, Stell. Hold your horses. Stell, get ready for this. Stell Group's very interesting. I've mentioned Richard Keenanger on this program a couple of times, but there's a powerful resonance with what this group did. And it's interesting because you're going to find all sorts of people came out of that Stell group. And eventually, even the people who put on Ancient Aliens, one of the main guys, Hatcher Childress, who actually published Joseph's book recently, he was part of the Stell group. So, Stell has had that big influence. Here's Keenanger. Keenanger comes forward with all this information about Atlantis and Lemuria and all about how there's going to be earth changes. And the book is called The Ultimate Frontier. It is an astonishing book by any measure of your imagination. Now, Keenanger, his story is simply that these brotherhoods contacted him early on, and they wanted him to build this community that would sort of reenact the mystery traditions and prepare us and, use this kind of Lemurian economic system, all kinds of wild things, and that would survive a pole shift and all this kind of stuff. Now, little by little, even while he's writing the book, you can feel this. Something goes astray. And something goes awry with him. And if you get into Keenanger's background, his mom was a single mom, and she used to bring him to the Lemurian Fellowship meetings in California when he was a child. And he imbibed all that information. And eventually, when he started to put this information out, they were like, "Oh, you're taking all the information from our lessons, you're banned from the group." But the guy who started that was Dr. Stell. And Keenanger will call his community the Stell group. So there's a lot in the kind of Stell philosophy, and there's a piece there that deals heavily with Atlantis and its influence on us now. But anyway, there's a there's one essay, Space Vehicles and Travelers. And someone named Nyquist, who keeps a Stell blog over in Europe, decided to follow up on this, because I remembered there was a set of 3 books called Observations by Keininger, which are different from the Stell Group Ultimate Frontier book, which, by the way, is written by Eklal Kushana, which is, I guess, the spiritual name of Keininger. It's a weird name, too. So in this essay, Space Vehicles, Travelers, and Travelers, it originally shows up in the book Observations. And it said, regarding flying saucers, some are interplanetary vehicles, others are of earthly origin. The ones which are from this planet are saucer-shaped and trapezoidal cross-section with 3 hemispherical engine pods on the underside. They were first developed by man on this planet about 20,000 years ago and have been used by members of the Brotherhoods continually since that time. Now, this is interesting to me because Keininger, although he unraveled and, he was even removed from the Stell Group, and, his later career doesn't really go very well, to say the least. But what's interesting to me is when he's at this point of knowing, at this point of having some contact with this whole brotherhood piece, and he certainly knows a great deal from training in Dr. Stell's group, then he's putting this together and saying the brotherhoods created the ships and they continue to use them. That is a very valuable piece of information because it makes a lot of sense that groups perpetuated this. Let's remember what Cayce said when they asked him, well, tell us about, these Atlantean ships. And he said, well, they were exactly like what Ezekiel described in terms of communications and teleportation, except it was a much later date when it happened. This is important because what Ezekiel describes is a gigantic mothership, basically. And if, in fact, Ezekiel is encountering them, say, around 2000 BC, and Atlantis, the end of Atlantis is 10,000 BC. If someone kept that technology for 8,000 years for it to show up and for him to see it. And there's an interesting interlude there where, of course, Ezekiel looks at it and he says, oh my God, in the middle of it is the terrible crystal. Well, the terrible crystal is what Cayce said the Two-Eye Stone became known as, because even though it had done these amazing things, by the end they were using it to, zap villages, and it was like a nuclear device practically. It was used strictly for warfare. And it had, come out of the hands of the initiates. So we're looking at some very, very interesting information coming down from Keininger saying, actually, the ships were being used by the Brotherhoods. This is the idea of them preserving the tradition and preserving the technology, but also using it. And that gets us into all kinds of interesting territory. Let's look at some of the potential pieces. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist program. This is X Series 148, and we're talking about Atlantis NightSide UFOs revealed. We're going to be taking your questions here momentarily. And this brings a lot of information in. Miss Olivia.
What? I have nothing ready for you because I've been fighting dirty little sex bots. And they're pretty dirty tonight.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I called in Philos to try to help us with this. And now I guess.
Well, you know what's happening. Actually, we can talk about this.
Yes.
We have Rosterman the Seer says, DJ and Olivia, what do you think about the largest satanic gathering in history in Boston this weekend?
Unbelievable.
So it's 3 days at the Marriott Copley, and it is sold out, which means, Violet Lotus said, that means Satanists have flown in from all points to gather. I was feeling really ill before the show, and I did not make that connection, but I'm going to connect it right now.
Listen, I hear they have a 2-for-1 buffet for every Satanist. So just get over there while you can. Yeah, let's just say that's interesting. One heck of a location to do that. Unbelievable. All right. Are you ready for some Atlantean UFOs? Let's take a look at some examples of flight of the Atlanteans and some stories, and then we'll get into Steiner's comments because I think they're very eye-opening on this, and I want to make sure I get them in. This is the classic pre-Columbian artifact from Central America that proves that the culture before Columbus arrived understood what flight was. You've got a complete outline of it. Now, we've all gone through the ancient aliens and all this kind of trip stuff. And like I said, a lot of that information is furnished by Childress. And so they sort of pumped it out over a number of years. The problem is the show, even though they do a nice job with graphics and everything like that, and I have my own weird history with them, but the show itself is basically a superficial romp, and it always has to come back to the same thing. And they got so desperate at a certain point, they were like, hey, cowboys and aliens, let's do that one. And you know how it's going to go. So for me, that's a very low dosage of the thing. It's not very potent. The potent aspect of this question goes a lot deeper than just, hey, look, it looks like that guy's wearing a headgear that looks like an astronaut's helmet. Actually think about the implications of Cayce's work saying the Atlanteans had flight and then them finding these things and really proving out his point. Let's keep it on a level. Now, check this out. Thanks to 3D printing, a group of researchers at Tongil University College of Aerospace Engineering and Applied Mechanics decided to test the feasibility of flying these aircraft. By utilizing a combination of 3D printing and laser cutting, the team first modeled the pendants in CAD before printing them out on FFF-based 3D printers. Now, they got some very interesting results when they printed them out. That was the model. But they found they were perfectly flight capable. So some advanced schematic left over in a small model, probably passed among initiates. This thing, I found out, if you go deep enough, it gets pretty wild. This thing is called the flying avocado. It is from an ancient Egyptian inscription, which is dated to 1750 BC. It's got two wings on its side, and they're sort of worshiping this flight aspect in the middle of it. The reference, we've seen all these incredible things from light bulbs. And of course, I printed out the Abydos helicopter for tonight as well. One of the fascinating things about the Abydos Stela is they did this real heavy duty hit job on it. And I'm going to tell you how it worked because I've spoken to real archaeologists about it. Now, that is one of the most compelling images for advanced technology. It shows tanks, it shows helicopters, it shows flying machines. It's a done deal. It's in our thumbnail tonight. The hit job that they've done on it is they've said, oh, that is just, it's two hieroglyphs together from different periods, and it wasn't meant to be an image. Let me tell you the real story I've got from people who were ace archaeologists, including Carmen Bolter when she was in Egypt. Well, she wasn't an archaeologist, but a lot of the other people were. The late Carmen Bolter, who gave us so much around Egypt and was a real good friend to the show. That piece is interesting because when they were working on the temple at Abydos in modern times, a whole front stone fell out, and underneath it was hidden this fabulous image of these helicopters and tanks. And interestingly enough, as it turned out, the hit jobs on it started immediately, and they don't make any sense. They're like, oh, that's a hieroglyph. Forget about it. Stop thinking about it. Oh, that's actually two hieroglyphs, and that's old, and some stone fell on it. That's why it looks like that. The most ridiculous things you've ever heard in your life, and I hear them repeated all the time when this piece comes up. So it shows you how easily people are brainwashed. If you go half an inch deep, all of those objections go completely out the window. The thing is one of the oldest pieces, and it was the most preserved because it was hidden under another slab of rock. Now, that's the real story. How much can we handle the real story? And this is quite a head fake, but the story that's been going on about RFK Jr., and people have floated this on Twitter and Facebook and all this nonsense, and I've gotten emails about it. Let me tell you, it's the same type of brainwashing. And the story is, he wants to lock up climate change, people who object to climate change deniers. If you go back and you look at the clip and the thing that he put out there, he wants to make sure that people in corporate positions of power who pollute small areas like we're seeing in East Palestine go to jail and have to answer for polluting those areas. That's the exact opposite of how it's being portrayed. But you have all these robots coming up and, they're not using any brains. There's no brain power left in there. They've just been brainwashed by the media saying one little thing, and they run around saying, and it is the Biden forces putting that out. Now, flash forward to this Egyptian story. You get the same exact programming. When they don't want you to see something, they give you a story, and that's it. You run around with the story. I remember when they blocked the records on the JFK files, and this whole story got floated out immediately that they were waiting for George Bush to die before they could do it because it was embarrassing. And I said, that's ridiculous. W's his son. He's going to be alive. That would be embarrassing for that president. Where is this coming from? But it was some weird excuse to put people to sleep about, hey, let's wait till George Bush dies. These are the weird things that go on out there. And it only takes a little bit, and I mean just a little bit of dark journalism to blow them away. But the Abydos Stela is exactly one of those. So keep that in mind as we go. A little bit further, I'm going to take us back to Stell and Kininger. This is the Stell group. They were set up to survive the pole shift. They had scientists in there, and they were all working off this Ultimate Frontier book. And eventually they booted Kininger for his various activities. Now, and it seems to me that Kininger, from being someone who understood on a very, very deep level the schools themselves, they had unraveled him, but good by the end. So that, this person with all this knowledge and all the rest of it had gone through a number of really kind of bad phases in his life. But the Stell group continued on. And interestingly enough, Kininger, at his height, as I mentioned, had some very interesting things to say. Let's go a little bit further. Richard Kininger and Stell, A Whole New Perspective, appeared in 2008. And this is again from that blog of the person who follows them, Nyquist. When I started corresponding with Walter Cox, one of the original residents of Stell, where he lived between 1971 and 1976, Walter was a very close friend to Kininger for many years. I found his name as he answered questions on cults and asked him many things about Stell, which later changed into private correspondence. Unfortunately, his answers on Stell and Kininger have today been deleted from the website. There's now a very interesting website, The Stell Experience, with interviews of old and new Stell residents. Walter Cox is interviewed in a 4-part, 1-hour series. In one of his answers on cults, Walter Cox wrote regarding Kininger, to sum up, I would say that Kininger showed less respect for the truth than any person I've ever met. So he goes into this whole thing. But an interesting thing comes out. In the 1950s, Kininger was a graduate student of the Lemurian Fellowship in Ramona, California. He gleaned most of the content of the Ultimate Frontier from lesson material published by the organization. He was expelled from the Lemurian Fellowship for revealing their information. In 1963, formed the Stell Group in Chicago, which eventually led to the founding of the Stell community in the beginning of the 70s. He was asked to leave Stell in 75. Now, Kininger, there's a very strange story about Kininger and the Brotherhoods that kind of confirms his story that the Brotherhoods had contacted him. And it has to do with this Walter Cox person. By one of his, he talked to one of the old friends of his in Stell, a man he trusts and who he knew wasn't spinning tales. He was impeccably honest. Walter gives him the alias Victor, but he was confidently told me his real name. Victor spent many years of hard work at Stell, but in the 1980s, he began wondering about the validity of his achievement, and emotionally destitute, he voiced a prayer, "Dear God and dear brotherhoods, if you exist, please let me know if this community is for real. Please let me know if I'm just wasting my time here, if I've risked my family and everything else for nothing. Please let me know if Keenager has been telling the truth and if I should stay." Keenager's already gone out of the group. Victor went to sleep and the next morning awoke to a telephone call. The voice on the other end said, "Hello, I'm calling in reference to your request for more information. I'm calling to answer your questions about Richard Keenager and the validity of your presence in Stell. Perhaps we can arrange a meeting." A date was set, and a few days later, a large Mercedes pulled up in front of Victor's house. An elderly Chinese man and a young man of perhaps 15 stepped out. To Victor's surprise, it was the young man, Jim, who did the talking while the Chinese man waited in the car. It's interesting, too, that it's a Chinese man that is at one of these initiations that Keenager talks about. The young man said it was his first assignment from the Brotherhoods, that he was sent to provide Victor with crucial information. Jim confirmed that Richard Keenager had indeed been contacted by the Brotherhoods as a young man, but later they came to the conclusion that he would misuse the information, and they assigned various keepers who tried to limit the damage Richard might cause. Despite Richard's fabrications, Jim said that Stell had gained positive attention of the Brotherhoods and had the potential to develop in the planned direction. Jim encouraged Victor to stay in the community and help provide leadership at a crucial juncture. And Victor did, in fact, stay. In the middle of the 1990s, Victor began to question the experience and wondered about Jim. With the help of the internet, he succeeded to trace Jim's phone number, because remember, the guy had called him years before. When Victor phoned Jim, he was surprised that he'd been able to find him, but he confirmed the information he had provided some years earlier. Later, when Victor tried to search the internet again, Jim's name, all information, everything about him had been deleted. With the help of Walter Cox, I tried to contact Victor by email to confirm the story. So a weird thread there about Keenager and the Brotherhoods and the way that thing went off the rails. But it seems like there was some group operating directly out of California in this period to kind of set up Stell, and that things went awry. But this wonderful thing that we get from Keenager and from Stell, Beyond the Ultimate Frontier, which I think does have some interesting, very fascinating information in it, is the fact that the Brotherhoods used the UFOs and had been for 20,000 years. Okay, Steiner on the Atlantean UFOs. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 148, going deep with all of you tonight, and it's terrific to be here with so many of you. We're going to take questions shortly, and Miss Olivia is putting those together now. How are you doing?
Good. Do you want a question?
Sure.
Okay, this is a great question concerning Cayce. So Hizzo says, I know Cayce was serious about stopping the readings if they conflicted with his view on religion. Did he ever discuss anything about the firmament or how life on other planets didn't interfere with his beliefs?
The curveball was reincarnation, but he understood and came to realize that there are aspects, such as when Jesus refers to Elijah, John the Baptist as Elijah, that reincarnation was systematically taken out of the Bible at a certain point. So he's able to kind of live with it. But because of his stance, in many different places, whether it was Ohio, Virginia, Alabama, he'd be thrown out. Even though he was a top Sunday school teacher, they would be like, oh, we heard about this guy and his psychic stuff and reincarnation. He's out of here. So this is the kind of cross that he had to bear for what he was doing. But look, the esoteric Christianity coming forward in this period, these are the people who had to kind of put on the suit of armor and do it, because people like Steiner, people like Cayce had to bring the Christian mysticism aspect, the esoteric Christian, in. Gurdjieff's work, what does he say it is when they ask him? He says it's esoteric Christianity. Well, basically, it's the inside piece of Christianity, and we have the outer portion of Christianity, but the mystical side is hidden. There's a fabulous refrain that happens in exchange when they say to Gurdjieff, well, why don't they just let everything out, these mystery brotherhoods? Like, why does everybody have to search for it? And he says, well, you've got the what to do and how to do it. And the what to do is put out there, and you get it through religion. And that's what we show up to church for, and all the rest. Let's turn the other cheek and all the rest of it. But how to do that is kept hidden, and it's kept and passed among these groups, because the how to do it is always persecuted when it comes up into the public, because those are methods and ways. So he went into a whole thing about, like, you may desire to turn the other cheek if someone slaps you, but 9 times out of 10, your body's going to react so fast that there's no way in heck that's going to happen. So therefore, what's the point? Obviously, there's a way to do that. There's an actual technique for doing these things. So what to do and how to do it, that's how we get some understanding of how the mystery schools work. The what to do is out there in the spiritual renaissance, in the spiritual traditions, but the how to do it is, again, moves in this underground circles. But yeah, I think it was a challenge for Cayce. Everything that came up in relation to this, including the Atlantis part, he had to check in with his Sunday school side. But look, the Cayce readings are some of the most compelling things you've ever read about. In terms of Atlantis, it is the edgiest stuff anywhere. And it's so advanced and ahead of its time. And I think the ARE is afraid of it. And I think that they're good people and maintain and preserve a tradition of Cayce's work. But let me tell you, they do not promote the Atlantis side. They don't know what to do with it. And
which is so strange now, because it's so obvious
I know
that people who never really bought into the Atlantean thing now can see cycles repeat themselves, and this is exactly what's happening again.
Well, it's incredible because it does fulfill what Cayce was talking about, which is, here we're back as the Atlanteans. We're facing this moment again, and what's going to happen? Are we going to do ourselves in like we did last time and go back to a very kind of dark ages period of readjusting, and recapturing the ability to have culture? Is it going to be that kind of wipeout? Because if you look from the Great Pyramids, for example, there's an incredible degeneration of culture after that. And by the time you get into the so-called Dark Ages, what happened? What went on? Well, Graham Hancock says we're a culture with amnesia. Basically, the Atlanteans almost took everything out. So all that information went underground and the technology with it. And so little by little, you had this next wave of learning again from the ground up. And of course, that could happen, with this culture. Look at the track that it's on. For sure it could. All right. Rudolf Steiner. We do a lot with Steiner. You can never do enough because of all the incredible things that he added to our lexicon in terms of the eighth sphere, the harmonic force. I've put on the record that I believe Steiner spent 4 decades trying to articulate Ahriman to us and warn us and let us know about this dark astral thing inhabiting the technology coming in the 21st century. And you will find, going through his work, that this theme is there strong all the way through. Here's Steiner on some of the Atlantean development. The Atlantean could do something. He knew what to do in order to transform the force in a heap of corn into mechanical power, just as the man of our day can transform into like power the force of warmth in a heap of coal. In Atlantean times, plants were not cultivated merely for use as food, but also in order that the slumbering force in them might be rendered serviceable to their commerce and industry, just as we have contrivances for transforming the latent force of coal into the power to propel our engines. So had the Atlanteans devices for heating by the use of plant seeds, in which the life force was changed into a power applicable to technical purposes. In this way, they were propelled, the airships of the Atlanteans, which soared above the earth. These airships sailed at a height Rather, below that of the mountains of Atlantean times, they had steering appliances by means of which they could be raised above these mountains. We must picture to ourselves that with the great advance of time, all the conditions of our earth have greatly changed. And he goes on to describe exactly, how they operated. Science and logical thought can never, from their very nature, determine what is possible and what is impossible. Their task is only to explain what has been proved by experience and observation, and the density of the air here spoken of in occult experience, as much a certainty as any given fact of the world of sense can be today, is just as firmly established by the facts. So what he's getting at is that the period of their scientific advancement, the reason that we can't wrap our heads around it is because the atmosphere and everything was different. He says, when the will of the Atlantean turned to evil and used these forces for egotistic purposes, night side forces, he simultaneously evoked the forces of water and of air, released them, and ancient Atlantis perished as a result. The continents came into existence through the cooperation of the elements and man, but now the Ahrimanic influence was gradually able to become so strong that man could no longer see the spiritual. Behind physical matter, he could see nothing except the mineral element, the inorganic, and therewith the magical powers had vanished even more completely from him. In the Atlantean epoch, man was able to control and master the life force and the plant kingdom. In the Lemurian epoch, lay within his power to control the seminal forces of animals, and indeed, it actually came to the point of Lemurian man applying these seminal forces of animals to transform animal forms into human forms. Each such magical action performed by man with the seminal forces causes a release of the forces of fire. When such will becomes evil, the worst forces of black magic are generated and evoked. Today, the most evil forces of the earth are still released when black magicians mishandle forces that are, generally speaking, withheld from mankind. These forces are powerful and at the same time holy. They are forces that, in the wise hands of worthy guides and initiates, can be applied in the highest, purest service to humanity. Those are the night side forces. It's a dangerous mix. You have to be able to have initiates working with that. And unfortunately, with the high technology that we have a number of regressive individuals operating. There's more on the UFO side coming, but we're going to jump here to your questions, and Miss Olivia.
What book was that from? You were reading from?
This is a lecture, but you'll find the crux of this in Cosmic Memory. Is his Atlantis and Lemuria and an outline of occult science they all repeat the same information, and it is powerful. Indeed. Yes.
Okay, Catherine Harris, could the abuse of power in Atlantis have resulted in the Great Flood? George Fletcher says the leaders of Atlantis brought on a great cataclysm to the world. This from misuse of their knowledge to conquer their neighbors. No human being will ever win going against nature.
Well, the Atlanteans were no ordinary human beings. They had developed such a psychic faculty. They were superhuman. And that's why when they come back and they reincarnate in the 20th century, everything gets turned upside down. I mean, you went from, 1910, like horse and buggy times, to going to the moon in 50 years. And of course, they stopped going to the moon for 50 years after that. But it's interesting to me because we need to regard the Atlanteans. The Atlanteans could do anything with the power of their minds, including travel the universe, according to Cayce. So, we're looking at the height of such a height in the development of the human being that this is why it's an interesting piece. We talk a lot about, UFO disclosure, give me disclosure, it's going to change humanity. Well, how about a disclosure of the fact that humanity has the ability with our minds to do anything that we want? And that this is our heritage? That's kind of the biggest disclosure. And the idea that we have peers out there is significant, but it doesn't rise to the level of the story of Atlantis and what we have there. So, but this is this is the nature of the questions. What's interesting is there's a weird piece, a weird tale, if you will, in the Cayce readings that gives a date for this worldwide meeting. And that he said, well, it's like if you had a worldwide broadcast today where all the leaders of the groups came together, and they all came together in Poseidia. And what they decided to do was to use the two-eye stone as a gigantic death ray to get rid of what sound like dinosaurs. Now, our traditional dating of dinosaurs is that they were exterminated 65 million years ago. Is that right? There's a whole kind of raft of archaeological artifacts that show, dinosaurs. So something's wrong with the schism of the timeline there. There's also a weird fascination with the Carnegie Institute and with Andrew Carnegie around any find having to do with dinosaurs. Well, it's interesting because when Cayce's talking about it and he goes, yeah, well, and they actually brought this on themselves. This is part of their undoing, which is, basically he makes it sound like they created the dinosaurs. And I started to wonder, gee, did they, while they were messing with this DNA, the Atlantean scientists, did they have kind of a gigantic Jurassic Park? And they asked Cayce, what's the date of this meeting where they decided to do this? And he says 50,722 BC. And he said what happens is they tune this death ray too high and it splits the island. This is one of the first destructions of Atlantis. Then further on, they again make the mistake of using the two-eye stone and splitting it into 3 islands. And then finally, they set the impressions from the two-eye stone too high, and instead of having this effect of lifting gravity, it pulls things down. Where that area of the Bermuda Triangle holds the whole mystery to that, and that is the whole kind of apotheum key that we get into of why things don't operate normally there. Look at apotheum for a moment in the UFO file. And apotheum is, a word I basically I made up, or did I? Because it shows up in history, it turns out. It's APOTHEUM. Here's the thing about apotheum. Look at a UFO report. Okay. There's an object there and someone can see through it. That's unusual. It's a transparent object, but it's fully there. So apotheum upsets the normal laws of physics. So someone enters a UFO, and then when they get back returned in an abduction incident, all the time has changed. They have missing time, right? Oh, I've lost 2 hours. So their relationship to time changes. That's another one. Nothing will grow after a UFO lands. John Mack, I was fortunate when I was 18 to know someone who was an assistant to John Mack. And I got to meet Mack on several occasions. And there's a weird kind of family thing there. Now, what's interesting is Mack, she told me, was training people, not in, hey, get a telescope out and all that. He was training people to astral travel in order to not be abducted. So this is unusual. The other thing that's interesting about what was going on there is the cases that they were telling me about, the people were all being abducted through walls. And then I went years later and looked back on all this literature, and you have tons of cases like that. So that's not in any kind of normal physics. So all the apotheum effects that are active in the weird blowout that occurs with the taking out of the two-eye power network in Atlantis all have that same type of recurring theme of physics being upset and turned upside down. Like when people go into the Bermuda Triangle, compasses spin, nothing operates normally. They go into cones of clouds. Sometimes they come out the other side. Other times they just disappear. Sometimes they are flying for 2 hours, but they only had a half hour worth of fuel, all this kind of stuff. So it upsets the normal checks and balances in a physical reality where there are no uh, where there is no law around physical reality, there's no reality. So whatever it is that's operational inside the UFO has this impact. It has this effect, and there's so many different things that are like this around the UFO about apotheum, but it goes back because the same things operational in the destruction of Atlantis have this. So whatever this ability is that we find in UFOs that they've been studying, they are worried about it. This is where they've developed groups like X Protect to make sure this thing stays in their hands. And I have to put this on the record. I heard one of the stupidest things I've ever heard about the UFO file. And I'm sorry, I don't like to drag on other researchers, but this has been a problem for a while, and it's stolen. Again, going to bat recently and saying that TTSA was this great thing and that all the people, who went after Elizondo and called him a CIA agent were wrong and all that. No, I mean, this was a CIA group that came in to dominate this narrative. This is the problem with the UFO field, which is you can't go in there looking for the truth and be in the business of finding the truth and, not tell the truth, because then you just get out of the business, So there's something so bizarre about people like that and people like, unfortunately, who've done good work like Knapp and other people. And they get behind this weird, now they're trying to resuscitate, the lying corpse of TTSA, and that thing came forward as a CIA operation to deceive people and push a UFO threat narrative from the Central Intelligence Agency through Homeland Security, through the media to the public. And for my money, in February with the China balloon and the UFO shoot downs, this is part of their data mining operation to do this. So researchers like that who continue to back up what has been proven wrong and proven false and proven fraudulent by writers like John Greenwald at the Black Vault or the New York Post, it's been exposed already. What is it that you're hanging on to? Who's telling you to hang on to it? And why did these researchers go so hard and heavy after people like me who were exposing them? Why did they say, oh, they're mentally paranoid, they'll be made to look foolish? Well, no, it turns out that got made to look foolish, but who made you look foolish? So it's weird because what happened in the background there, and I heard a lot of stories about TTSA going to people and saying, if you're in this with us, we're going to share the secret with you. You'll be the fly on the wall, baby, And it's kind of a gross aspect of the end collapse of the UFO field. But for me, somebody sent me a clip of this dribble and I couldn't believe it. You're still going to hang on to TTSA, really? After it's a proven CIA operation? It's like, oh yeah, everyone called them CIA. Yeah, because one of the top people in CIA started it, Jim Semivan, who wasn't even on the record in 2015. He didn't even exist. That's how high level a CIA operative he was. So there's something weird about it. And there's something weird about Knapp too. I'm sorry. I love Knapp. Knapp did great work for years. I've been in touch with these guys before. I've interviewed one of them. I was going to interview Knapp, I think in 2016 or something. I have great respect for the work that goes back there, but this other thing, you cannot do it. I know too much about the CIA and their involvement in the UFO file. You can't fool me, so it's just not going to happen. So their idea was, oh, well, we'll say that guy's paranoid about it, and, but people like Elizondo coming out and with a book deal, and now they're going to say, oh, they have a psychic, this guy was a psychic and he's in the CIA and, he went to Lou, who was the head of the UFO recovery program, ATIP. That doesn't exist. We already know, it's been proven in documents that he put on the record that it wasn't funded, it wasn't a government project, it was an activity of his own, right? So it's an activity. So like, playing darts is an activity. So I don't like, just like what we were talking about earlier with the RFK Jr. thing about climate change, this is BS, those are propaganda points. The Elizondo thing around UFOs, these are all CIA people, and this is the problem with them, going on these shows, and the people who interview them don't understand that the CIA has this program about the threat. That's something that has to be changed. And when you have people in our field or around the UFO file who are supposed to be independent promoting that, it's a problem. Investigative journalism, I don't like to drag other researchers, but investigative journalism does not allow for, just saying, well, forget it. Investigative journalism gets to the bottom of the thing. And so why are these people who were good researchers previously kissing up to CIA people? Why? It's a good question. And I had to mention that because it came up and I was like, oh, I had expected people of Knapp's ilk to come out and say, like, we were misled just like everyone else by TTSA and Elizondo and all that. Instead, they're still saying that people who called them out were, deranged or whatever, and that, they did good things and lose not CIA and all that. I mean, come on. It's already proved out. How much more proof do you want? In some cases, like with people like Gary Nolan, they do this. They say, Gary Nolan's not CIA. What are you talking about? He says it in his own bio. Read his bio. I work for the CIA. I worked on this project, this project, this project. The CIA had me studying. There are articles about it. Look online. What is the problem here? And it's interesting because Nolan is somebody who knows the stuff very well. So it's particularly bothersome. But one of the things that he said was, there is no UFO threat, and that the media is not promoting a UFO threat at all. And all you read is about the UFO groups, like Arrow and all that stuff, slipping this stuff out to the press to say, hey, there might be a mothership hovering over Earth, and they're sending out spores and all this stuff. I mean, come on, all you have to do is do half-inch deep research, which we know that these guys can do. So that's bothersome. I mean, let's get real, okay? What's behind that? Why are they still protecting the TTSA operation? And TTSA is by an entertainment company now. They didn't make a lighter than air, anti-gravity machine. They got off the front page. So what is it? What is the nature of that propaganda? That's the kind of stuff which, we need transparency in our own independent media. How are you ever going to get it from a higher place? You can go, oh, that government needs to give us the truth. And then you promote a bunch of people from the government. How does that make any sense? Someone's going to explain that one to me. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Deep tonight on the Atlantean UFOs and the night side aspects involved. Miss Olivia, you've been patient with your questions. Yep. I want to remind everyone to sign up for our newsletter. This is important because, the newsletter is basically how we stay in touch with each other. And when we're looking at all this incredible censorship that takes place, that's something which is free and allows us to stay in touch. And it lets you know some incredible, and I mean incredible, interviews that we have coming up for you, X-series episodes that'll blow your mind, and some exciting events and documentaries coming your way. So make sure that you're signed up for that. Take a minute and do it, especially if you're new. It only takes a moment, and it's free. And it'll stand up and be counted, because you want to make sure with some of the stuff we have coming up that you get to it first. So let's get to it.
Okay. I just wanted to say, Gigi Young said CIA narratives dominate ufology and New Age to an extreme degree.
Gigi understands it really well, and she has to grapple with it as I do. So she's seen it, and she's seen the narratives around it. And in some cases, just like with me, she sees people that she knows previously have done good work, kind of jumping onto this thing. So we have to have her back on to talk about it. And soon we have an exciting episode coming up with Gigi planning in the background. So watch for it. Yes.
All right. Let's get back to the 2 eye stone. All right. So Kathleen Beck wants to know who is controlling the 2 eye stone this time around. And D-Light says, do you think the 2 eye stones accessed an old AI, perhaps the thing that influenced today's tech creators?
Well, it's interesting. The two-eye stone is like a living system. And the idea of the night side aspect being involved, it means that calling in an influence, like a supernatural influence. Um, the way that Cayce described the two-eye stone was, it's very interesting actually, because he would say that the priestesses themselves would interact, they'd be trained by the initiates to interact with the stone, and then they could contact the outer spheres of the saintly realm. Now, and get those messages directly. That's pretty compelling. What happened was, that's the Amelius group and all of the aspirational Poseidians. What happened, unfortunately, is there was a group that imitated them, that was good at imitating what they did, but they had a totally different point of view. And they were particularly interested in how Amelius created these beings. So Amelius in the Cayce story comes along and notes the separation of men and women. So it's the early kind of Adam period. Now, but in Atlantis, this is 200,000 BC, according to Cayce. Now, this is also compelling because before that, we're supposed to see these bodies that are united in one sex. And it's very crucial that we split into these complementary halves in order to spiritually evolve. Amelius is the one who takes care to see that that happens in Atlantis. Now, as far as I can say, when we're looking at that whole period and going back into that, it's very interesting because Amelius shows up as a number of different, the inspiration for Manu, the inspiration for the high initiates. But in Cayce's story, he's a very early incarnation of Jesus. So, and he often says Amelius as Adam. So there's something about Amelius that is, he's right outside of the realm of physicality. And then as Adam, he becomes physical. Now, Amelius, when it comes to the two-eye stone, he develops this whole ability for people to be trained after a spiritual way. And what's happening is there's a lot of forces battling over humanity's evolutionary track. So the two-eye stone and the way that it's used is a way to keep that direct connection, just like in the School of the Prophets, they have the Ark of the Covenant and things of this nature. It's the same echo of this process. But what happens is the Belial group figures out that the two-eye stone can do other things and that it has this ability to master things, and it becomes the power station. They utilize it for power, and they get that whole high-tech civilization. The problem is they use it as basically a laser destruction device. And this is what Cayce says eventually sets off the volcanic activity inside the Earth that takes down the first island, and then it splits the island, and then it splits it into 3 islands. And then from there, they have progressive problems. By the end, you have a fierce battle going on between the sons of Belial and the Amelius group. And the final battle there takes place in the hot zone. And then that's basically at the Amelius group figures out, okay, we see what they're doing. This is what we need to do. They're going out of their minds. They're going to destroy civilization. We need to preserve civilization. So this is the Noah's Ark story. And they hide the Hall of Records in those 3 different places. So when we get into Pawgate, which is something we did our 5-year anniversary special on, you have to watch Pawgate because the symbol of that Hall of Records is, as Cayce said, it's the right paw of the Sphinx. That's the entryway into the Hall of Records. I found through Augustus Le Plongeon's work in Yucatan, the Yucatan Sphinx. And this is never talked about, and it disappeared. It was found in 1876. There are pictures of it. It's there on record for 12 years, disappears in 1888. So that thing is very significant in terms of what this is about. And the area where that Hall of Records is known as the Paw Stone. So that whole thing dovetails to that. And that's, that's kind of the I think, the takeoff point. Yes.
Najat Madri, could the mystery of Golgotha have anything to do with the destruction of Atlantis? And Nanette Chris says, Najat Madri, yes. Golgotha was said to be the petrified skull of the first Adam, Emilius in Cayce. Jesus was the last Adam, therefore crucified to indemnify the sins of the ancestors back to Adam.
Well, that's fascinating. It's true that Cayce says that Adam and Adam and Jesus are the same figure. And that's pretty compelling when you think about it, because it's Adam that, kind of tumbles into materiality. And, that whole story is shrouded in esoteric imagery. But it is fascinating when you get there, because there are a number of lives that are attributed to Jesus by Edgar Cayce, 30, in fact. So, and some of the, I would say, more interesting, one of them is Jeshua. And he also has him as Zend, who was the father of Zoroaster. So Zoroastrianism, that whole thing, which has such a mirror image to Christianity and is where Ahriman comes out of, that is all, part of Jesus' incarnation is Zen setting up Zoroaster to do this. So quite fascinating on that front. Yes.
John K. Was CERN built using secretly discovered Atlantean technology? And Sarah Ajagu, is the Large Hadron Collider at CERN a two-eye stone synthesis?
I think that they're going into that, tapping the night side forces with CERN. I don't think there's any doubt about it, because they themselves, if they start to interact with these other dimensions, which now we know, this used to be a conspiracy train, that, hey, CERN is opening up all this stuff. And you did see people going over the top, like, oh my God, all these demons are coming through CERN. But there have been a number of occult rituals associated with CERN. There's no question about it. It's on the record. And also, there's something weird about CERN in this regard, which is they eventually came about and said, well, we might be able to interact with other dimensions with it. Well, that's pretty gigantic for humanity if you do that. There's also the potentiality of CERN being used as a weapon. So we need to keep that in mind as we go also, that a number of these countries now, and again, we're talking about the Large Hadron Collider because CERN is a nuclear organization, in fact. It's nuclear exploration, but the Hadron Collider is the crux of the thing that we're talking about. And each country now, including the ones in China, the development, each country wants their own Hadron Collider. So this is going to get interesting. It seems to me that if you go through those past histories, the Varian brothers and others brought forward the Hadron Collider technology in the 1920s, the 1930s, those early experiments. And that piece becomes then pretty gigantic, because it is the particle colliders and the process that takes place there that opens up all kinds of doorways. And so CERN is just going to continue to grow. Yeah, what do you got?
No, I'm just thinking, like, how are we going to survive? It's almost, when you think about it, it's just, I'm a big one for Murphy's Law, It's like,
well,
if everybody has them, forget it,
Yeah, right. Well, it's how they did the whole thing with nuclear also. I mean, there was a possibility at a certain point of saying no one else gets nuclear. But that's not the way things went down, because there was too much of a profit margin. I did promise that I would show more of the Atlantean UFOs from Philos, the Tibetan. Here is one aerial submarine vessel entering the water, 1886. What do you think of that? It's pretty compelling. It's pretty high tech for 1886. I don't think there's any doubt about it. There's an Atlantean map inside the Dweller on Two Planets book. And I wanted to show that also because it does identify Poseid, not Poseidia, but that is Poseidia. And just a kind of a map of what it used to be versus what it is now. Those maps always interest me. And as far as I can tell, it's very consistent across the mystery school information. You've got the continent of Atlantis on one side. It has the Gulf of Mexico on the other, the Mediterranean. That is the landmass, everything in between. So, Spain, the UK, Cuba, and everything else that's involved there. It was interesting, too, the woman who got the reading about having been a Mayan priestess who was dealing with people from other worlds, she was from Cuba. I thought that was kind of an interesting little side note. Something else I left out about our friend Philos. A few weird things that he says here. Let's see if we can pick up on them. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show X Series 148. We're going deep tonight, and this is Atlantis NightSide UFOs Revealed. We're going to be taking more of your questions here, and we'll go maybe about another 20 minutes.
Okay.
When man was born into the earth from Mars, as he eventually is to be born from the earth into Hesper. Hesper is a weird thing that comes up in here. I'll explain it later. Hesper. That was the basis of the allegory of Adam and Eve. But back of them came all their lesser brethren, the animals of land, sea, and air. Back of the race birth were the race lives of man, and the lives on 2 other planets, neither of which are of matter which the earthly eye could perceive. There is in them now no life process, for these worlds are resting, and so also is Mars. Thus have I spoken of 4 of the 7 planets of which the human race makes cyclic visits, going from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, which is the Earth, to 5, Hesper, and to 1, which man will go after his years on Hesper, and thence to the 7th or sabbatic world. These 2 last, like the 2 first, are imperceptible to the eyes of man on Earth. 7 of the worlds are 7 times the race of men circles them. 3 times already hath man circled the series, and arrived en masse at the 4th of the number in his 4th round. So Philos, I speak of all these many race lives of Earth, of Hesper, of Mars, and all other human planets after the ordinary sense. But whosoever wills may go with our great master, escaping the rounds, and of that life no words can tell. But such will is rare, and few there be that find that way. Yet here are the signs along the path, hear them, heed, and thus find me. Use all things as abusing none, drugs as drugs, food not gluttonously, drinks not too many, society as a study, marriage as a way. Most of our race must go by the lower path, save he who holds their hands, and few of them that will be to let him. So there's a whole kind of religious treatise in the middle of all this. However, our friend Philos has let something interesting out there, which is he's talking about Hesper. Now, if you look at the interpretation of what Hesper is just known as the morning star. Well, in the Bible, everyone assumes that Venus is the morning star. So there's maybe something interesting being dropped with the name Hesper. It's also kind of out of place in a way in the middle of all that. I would say that's another of the interesting things that come up in Philos, along with his very unusual Atlantean UFOs. The last thing I want to say, and then we'll get right back to questions, is in the middle of this reading, actually it's this one. There is a mention about Poseidia, so we understand it on the level of which he's speaking from an esoteric point of view of how advanced that it was. So what he says is, we have the records of this entity now known as 877. These experiences in that environment called Poseidia in Atlantis, and giving the interpretations of these records as we find them, it is well that there be given something of the background or the variations, that there is not confusion. For in giving the experience of an entity's sojourn in a period as remote as the early destructive influences, in that land called Atlantis or Procydea. There is often confusion in the interpretation of the records as to whether Procydea was the land or Atlantis was the land. There were also other centers that were developing. For the projections, they began as many, and in creating influences, they began as 5, or in those centers where crystallization or projection had taken on such form as to become what was called man. Hardly could it be said that they were the exact form of the presence, for there were more of the influences that might be used when necessary, such as arms or limbs. Makes you think of the extra fingers of our friend. In following or interpreting the Poseidian period in Atlantis, let it be understood that this was only one of the groups, and it was the highest, the greatest advancement in the earthly sojourn of individual entities or souls in that particular period, or the highest that had been since that which had been part of the Lemurian age, because the Lemurians apparently just pure spiritual. The sons of Belial were of one group, or those that sought more the gratifying, the satisfying, the use of material things for self without thought or consideration as to the sources, nor the hardships in the experience of others. In other words, we would term it today, they were without a standard of morality, moral code. The other group, those who followed the law of one, the Emilius group, had a standard. The sons of Belial had no standard save of self. These are the groups that fight in the end. The name then that we would term in the present Dar was the entity, was active in the recording of the messages and developing of those forces that came with the use of the light that formed the rays upon which the influence from without was crystallized into what became as the sound from the outer realm to the static of the individual realm. This individual had been a priestess using the two-eye stone to connect with this outer saintly realm and receiving directly those messages. And it's interesting because he says, these were not only the rays from the sun set by the facets of the stone as crystallized from the heat from within the elements of the earth itself, but were a combination of these. And he goes on basically to track her rise in Poseidia as one of these leaders because of her ability to interpret the messages of the two-eye stone. And what the Belial group does is they have a propaganda campaign against the Poseidians and say, oh, you know, those messages aren't from God. Actually, we have the real God over here. And eventually what we've got with the Poseidians is that area of Bimini, Cuba, and the hot zone. That whole area becomes the last holdout and where the Poseidians really have controlled it, and they've held out against the Belial group. So there's something special about the area and the work that was done there. And so later, when we get into all the intrigues around the hot zone, I can't help but think there's a thread underneath having to do with those lost cities, that when they rise up, we're also looking at the rising up of the Poseidian Atlantean consciousness, because this is where the Emilius group was. And so their consciousness is rising, our awareness of them, our memory that's been slumbering for decades. Now, I know that that goes deep. It's a very esoteric concept, but I want us to think of the whole idea of Atlantis rising as that consciousness rising, that exercise rising. So when we see these records, it becomes something that is integrated into our subconscious. That's why the schools put this information out there. That's why there's confusion, I think, also in relation to the UFO aspect and how understanding and appreciating and remembering the Atlantean part of this can give us a whole different outlook on what we're talking about now in terms of UFOs. And that's why things like the UFO threat and all of this kind of nonsense are a completely materialistic sham concept, and also not sharing of the facts that we've already had this kind of technology operational in our own human background. That's significant, I think. And it's not just like, hey, we were cavemen and these aliens came down. It's a different story. And I think we need to, kind of put that out there and have that understanding that good Atlantean foundation in order to get us up to the next level. We understand it was a very high culture and there was a spiritual battle using high technology. It took them down. Now we're in that period again where we're reintegrating the lesson and encountering ourselves, in fact. Even in these, and encountering the sons of Belial through, the Bill Gates and the other kind of scumbag leaders. That really, I think, can help us see the nature of the moment, as it were. Miss Olivia.
Okay, so let's get back to that morning star thing for a minute. Okay, Timothy Guessing says, depending on the time of year, Venus can be the morning star or the evening star. And the Black Zionist said something really interesting. In the Bible, morning star is not a planet, but a position or title in God's army. Lucifer is the morning star. Then in Revelations, Jesus said he is the morning star.
That's true. All of those are true. And it's interesting. Well, there's a whole piece around the Lucifer aspect, which is interesting, which is Ahriman splits Lucifer, Steiner splits Ahriman and Lucifer in terms of Satan and Beelzebub. And what he's saying is that Ahriman is the actual devil. That's the actual traditional devil. And that the Luciferian force gets mixed in with the Ahrimanic force in traditional telling of this. But he refers to them as groups that are very watchful and interfere with humanity's development. However, it's the Ahrimanic force that is the one that they both harvest humanity to a degree, but apparently there's been some interaction before with the Luciferian forces that was different. And they call that Lucifernosis. So the Lucifernosis is something where by interacting with and facing off against these beings who want to lure men off of Earth. This is the thing. They want to lure them into their thoughts, into their thought realm. That this Lucifernosis, humanity can gain a lot from interacting with and learning from. Supposedly, we learned speech from Lucifernosis. So there was an actual physical encounter of Lucifer in incarnation in 3000 BC. And then Christ came. And then there's going to be an Ahriman incarnation. This is kind of how the evolutionary track works out. So we have the ability through Christ's incarnation to now face off against Ahriman. However, the Ahrimanic forces in Steiner's cosmology of things are ready and have been working through the technology to put humanity to sleep so they can come upon them unawares and basically create a false reality for them to inhabit. And that's the Ahrimanic realm. That's the eighth sphere. So the danger in Steiner's setup, what he's saying about Ahriman is that people will assume that we're going into progress because it's science, it's technology, and all the rest of it. But what's actually happening is a gigantic interference in our evolutionary track, which will keep us in a position where the Ahrimanic forces harvest humanity. So this is a deep concept, and we've explored it in the Eighth Sphere shows. But what I will say is this. Basically, it's kind of a virtual reality realm. And we're surrounded by that virtual reality now. And so you can see people saying, oh, I want to be augmented as a human and all this kind of nonsense. So that's the work of the Ahrimanic forces. It's not a human thing. It is turning humanity into a cyborg because humanity is not good enough, right? Well, humanity is good enough. And it's the nature of slavery that is compelling the argument.
You
on
know
the
what the
other
problem
side.
is that, we were not given the instruction manual, right? You have to.
Well, this is what the mystery school thing
exactly.
is about. I think
so they've kept it from us.
Yes.
So why it's humanity as a whole isn't developed enough because we literally have not been given the instruction manual. We're very dangerous vessels here, very complicated, and we're just left to figure it out on our own in real time.
Absolutely. And what a time it is. My goodness. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 148, going deep on Atlantean UFOs. We've given you Philos, the Tibetan. and The Dweller on Two Planets, Edgar Cayce in his work, and Rudolf Steiner's Anthroposophy, Blavatsky, Besant. Oh, I have a Besant in here somewhere. Let's see. Miss Olivia, give me something because I'm going to find this.
The Buddhist of Boston Sports. Could AI be our harmonic impulse? It is essentially like artificial intelligence and will trap us as we use more and more.
Yes, actually, I think it's a pretty good example.
I mean, it's taking away our thought. I mean, it's solving our problems for us. It's answering every question, so we don't actually have to deliberate at all. We're going to get to a point where we don't think anymore. It's going to do all our thinking for us.
Well, we become lazy, right? But think about it. The whole point behind so much of the esoteric teaching is thought forms. And what are the thought forms that are being developed in relation to virtual reality? In terms of AI, and remember that whole thing about meta and the metaverse and all that. This is what they want. They weren't able to quite pull it off in this round, but they're finding different ways to appeal to humanity on that side. But it's an excellent point. I would say that the harmonic thing, see, I'm not an anti-technology person. I edited a tech magazine for 10 years. I'm a huge fan of technology, and I don't think people should live like Luddites or anything like that, although I think people who do that are fascinating. But I think the impulse is to engage with it, but still remain human. This is the whole thing. And Gurdjieff said, well, a human can work with a machine and become more human by being aware while working as a machine. The thing is, what was to be avoided was to be mechanical. And this is how we kind of devolved, which was, our thoughts became automatic and humanity went to sleep. So under those circumstances, humanity does not develop and it becomes a plaything for other forces. So this is a very important, vital conversation. It's one of my opinions about this, about even the stuff that's going on with RFK Jr. and the censorship. It's just like what happens here, because the conversation, the ideas room is potent. It's a vital conversation. It can set fires in the hearts of humanity, and it can set us on so many different directions, and nobody's as smart as all of us, right? These are the types of conversation that they like to sideline. These are the types of conversation that they like to censor and, throw off. And we've seen it over and over again. So whether it's coming from the pharmaceutical industry, the military industrial complex, the intelligence agencies, or on the UFO file, we're in a mass of what Ouspensky calls lies and living in lies. So through that, we need to find a real path and a safe path. Here's Besant discussing the Atlantean airships. Very interesting little tale she tells. And of course, she took over Theosophy after our friend Helena Blavatsky passed away. And it's interesting because Blavatsky hand-selected her. The other person who was up for it was Emma Britton. And, Emma Britton had parted pretty harsh with Blavatsky because Emma Britton was still, deep in the Christian mysticism aspect of this. And Blavatsky had been thrown into this heavy, heavy Eastern climate. Besant says the whole formed a practically impregnable barrier against the spears, swords, bows, and arrows, which were the usual weapons of the time. But such a city necessarily lay open to assault from the above, and the Atlanteans carried the makings of fabulous airships. Airplanes, we call them now. This was written in 1912. To a high pitch of excellence, as if such a city were to be attacked, these birds of war were sent to hover over it and to drop onto it bombs which burst in the air and discharged a rain of heavy poisonous vapor destructive of human life. Allusions to these may be found in the conflicts related in the great epics of the Hindus. They had also weapons which projected sheaves of fire-tipped arrows which scattered far and wide, And as they hurtled through the air like deadly rockets, and many other similar kinds, all constructed by men well versed in higher branches of scientific knowledge, many of these are described in the very ancient books above referred to, and they are mentioned as being given by some superior being. The knowledge required for their construction was never made common. There's a lot in that piece, but she's giving us a snapshot there of how the airships gave the Atlanteans dominance, because a lot of these groups that they'd be battling against were on a spear and arrow kind of place, and all you'd have to do is send in, you do some heavy duty bomb dropping from above, and it's over pretty quickly. So, but she's saying it's being retained there in some of those stories that take us back into the Vimanas and things of this nature. What's interesting is she's also saying the technology was never left in the wrong hands. It was always, the construction was never made common. It was kept by the initiates. Now, when that situation goes into reverse, you have the Belial types, and they control the technology, and they use it for these purposes. But it is interesting because a lot of people have asked this, and I myself did, which is, what happened to the technology? Where did it go? And there are these references to it. Did they just forget how to do it? Well, somebody remembered. And that's why I think, this rediscovery in the 20th century and the 19th century of all kinds of different pieces around this give us the point that maybe they rediscovered, and it was kept, the ability of the Atlantean airships, and that explains to some degree these waves of UFO sightings. Now, UFO sightings, in my opinion, fall into these categories, and this is important. I think that we need to say that a great deal is emulation. That is, people inside that national security establishment have seen these things, have studied them, and have emulated them through crash retrievals and things of that nature. The things that they recovered could very well be off-planet aliens. The things that they've recovered, though, also could be directly from these schools. The things that they've recovered, though, could also be directly from these ancient groups who still held a tradition of the technology, and that technology was reborn and let out again, just as this Renaissance was happening. Now, when you look at the aerospace groups that we know are very developed in the 19th century, way before the traditional story goes about the Wright brothers and all that nonsense. So something's going on back there. Those aero groups are already very much ahead of it. And it looks like, in one of those images, it's been pointed out that the Delschau images contain the image of a uranium reactor. But the picture itself is from the 1890s. So therefore, where is all this coming from? There's an advanced technology group, and part of it comes certainly through the handing down of these through these schools. The thing is, you have two different levels of the schools, and that's the piece I think that has to be borne in mind. You have the right-hand path schools, which the public version of is Anthroposophy and Theosophy, which is trying to move the culture forward. And then there's this other thing. And it is the other thing that we're dealing with, I think, on a very regular basis. With that, Miss Olivia, two more questions.
Oh my God, there are so many great questions left. Okay. Fred D, is anything revealed about Göbekli Tepe indicating an Atlantis connection?
Well, the age would be the first thing. Look, Göbekli Tepe is a game changer on a number of levels because it's 12,000 years old. All the discussions around, Cayce can't be right, and the Egyptian story is all wrong, and all the things that we've exposed about Giza Gate, which is Mark Lehner and Zahi Hawass being, taking this kind of funding and taking this, basically, the Cayce Foundation sponsored them, and in particular Lehner. And so for them to basically put Cayce in a bad light and call him like some new age fruitcake, and then to, in the background, use his readings, just try to dig up the Hall of Records, what does that make you? So we see a lot of that. And so their arguments over and over again, when we had good people like Robert Schoch and Graham Hancock, the late John Anthony West, Robert Bauval, fantastic researcher, they went over there and they figured out a lot of things. One, the Great Pyramids were aligned to Orion's belt. That's very important. The archaeoastronomy proved that the Sphinx was looking out at the constellation of Leo in 10,500 BC. Gee, that lines up exactly with what Cayce said the date was. So there's all this confirmation that took place. What was the block? The block was Hawass and Lehner. And their argument was, well, we've got the in pyramids 2,500 BC, and then he says it's 10,500 BC. There's 8,000 years in between. Show me, the civilization in between. Well, Göbekli Tepe shows that there were active groups 12,000 years ago who had the ability to build temples and all the rest of it. And by the way, there's a number of sites now like Göbekli Tepe. And Göbekli Tepe had been unearthed in 1994, remember. It only got brought to light later because no one knew what to do with it, or it was intentionally suppressed by National Geographic, that kind of thing. They don't want to deal with giving you that information. Look they shut down Augustus Le Plongeon. What did he discover? I can read the Mayan hieroglyphs. I figured it out. I talked with the Mayans, he was an archaeologist, but he's also psychic. So that's why he found all the major things, the temples and everything else in Yucatan. So when we look at that, he went in 1888 to the American Archaeological Association and he said, look, here's the interpretation of all the Mayan hieroglyphs. And they were like, look, we just got out of a big war with the American Indians. Like, we're not going to say that they had all this incredible culture. Get out of here. So that's how history goes. We'll never get traditional history by trusting that. You can't make up history either. It has to be some combination of an open mind, some combination of good research, and some combination of psychic activity and the information left by the mystery schools. It is the crucial aspect. So many things have been determined by intuition. We need to use that as an operational piece. When I do dark journalism, I include all the research piece. But if you don't include the psychic aspect, you're not holding anything. You're missing something. You have to have that in there to get anywhere, because for sure the other side is using it. We've pointed out that presidents for years, look, Woodrow Wilson had Edgar Cayce come in these secret meetings to lay out the famous 14 points. They did all kinds of things using psychics. Gene Dixon saw Franklin Roosevelt, was a visitor 81 times to the Nixon White House. One of the most powerful advisors ever. Reagan, it was determined, it not only had Gene Dixon, other psychics, and 2 astrologers. These are people, all that stuff is just the glint of the top of the iceberg. I mean, what's beneath is a huge operational esoteric domain that includes secret societies. Look, if you go back, Rudolf Steiner talks about the situation that Helena Blavatsky faced when she came over to America in 1875 and approached the mystery schools. And Steiner said, well, look, when she went there, she knew all the secret handshakes and she was on their same level and all that. And they were so entrenched in the government, both left-hand and right-hand path schools, that it was basically, he was like, it was Mystery School America when she came here. So then when he refers in 1912 to the American government, he says, they're the American and British and German government, they're all honeycombed with the mystery schools. So the quicker we get on board with that, the quicker our understanding grows around it. And we start to understand, oh, they've been putting this stuff down, making it look foolish and all the rest of it for years for a reason. The reason is they're using it. They're using the very tools to suppress the population, and they take that away from the general population by making it look foolish, which they did for the UFO file until they realized it could be a great boondoggle for emergency powers and continuity of government. They'd been waiting on that one for a long time. Before that, they used to make anyone who got into it ridiculed, right? And it's interesting because they starved that field out so much that by the time 2017 came in and they rushed out the New York Times story and all that CIA nonsense about the UFO threat, there was nobody there to face off against them because they had starved the field out of good researchers. People would look at the field and be like, I'm not getting involved with that. Now you have a lot of jokers and circus people being like, hey, here's my Corbell documentary about Bob Lazar and all that. That doesn't get anywhere. Oh, I'm weaponized. It has nothing to do with the UFO file. The UFO file is vast. It gets into experiences that people have had with other beings. It gets into advanced technology. It gets into the deepest levels of the government. It doesn't have any of this, Fox News, New York Times joke version that the CIA is promoting. Don't ever fall for that. Yes.
Nijat Manu says, geez, what a mess.
I'm sorry. Them's the facts, as it says. Yes, what do you got?
I love this. Peter Rabbit says, DJ should put out a Mystery Schools for Dummies book.
I would love to do that.
Okay, so is this the last question?
Yes.
Then I'm going to bundle them and put them all together.
Yes, it's the Olivia bundle.
So Johann Wolf says, I would guess some certain initiates were dedicated to guarding and keeping the knowledge of how to use the craft alive for millennia. Mystery School's Space Force. Kathleen Beck says, does DJ think any of the ancient mystery schools of the right-hand path are alive and well today? And Simone Nyman says, does DJ think that the large underwater UFOs are remnants of Atlantis? Did the UFOs need special DNA to operate them, or did the automatons fly them? And Space Ghost says, what is the Atlantean link to the inner Earth peoples, the Agarthians, same peeps?
Oh, that's really interesting. Let's go to the things, the automatons. What does Cayce call them? He said, well, the Atlanteans basically trapped their souls and their will in these robots. Sounds like a cyborg to me. Repeatedly, he uses the term automaton. And it's interesting when you consider it. We've done a few shows on this. Gigi Young has touched on it. This is going to be important to understand what that strain of humanity was, how much of it survived as well. It was transmuted through the work of Rata in the Egyptian temple Beautiful. He created a program to take those cyborgs and have them become real human beings. And he helped them develop an endocrine system so that their reincarnational track wouldn't be messed up by this activity of the Atlantean scientists. And what happens with those Atlantean scientists is they created a race of slaves. But they used human DNA to do it. This is the nature of that problem. And so it's very interesting if you go into those Cayce readings talking about when the Atlantis goes down and they show up in Egypt. The big problem is they show up with tons of these automatons, slaves. So, and also they start to look at the native population and like, hey, you'd make a pretty good person in my team of slaves over here too. This is where the problem comes in because they're so technically advanced. So what happened in that interval of humanity? Well, for sure, the work that Rata did, cleared the path pretty dramatically. But what about some of the weirder aspects of this, like the automatons that went to America, for example? And I think it's worthy to note the appearance of some of the alien stories that we have, and particularly the Greys. There's something unusual about the appearance that may go far beyond anything just like, oh, somebody traveled here from a distant star. There might be a whole different aspect to this thing that I might inhabit in a different realm and come into your realm. Therefore, that whole thing about fuel goes out the window. It's just realm jumping. And you have to consider these things on that level. Now, and the system and the star system needs to be looked at on a very different level of different types of matter. So you're not going to find, this is the problem with the projection of, hey, there are all these humans hanging out on the moon. Like, look, something of actual physical presence took place on both Mars and the moon. I don't think there's any question about it. But the way that we need to look at them through the mystery school lens, I think, has more to do with them as schools for humanity. So, the general idea being in the Cayce readings, when you leave this earth, you go to a place like Venus, and it's a school of developing your emotions in this system. You go through that different, realms of what those planets represent, and then you come back here and bring that knowledge in with you. That's why astrology is so important, because it gives you a flash of where you're coming in from. So that maybe is a better way for us to interpret it. There may be a physical interface in another system, just like this system has a physical interface, Earth, where there's human life. So there may be in another system physical life as well that looks different than ours. So I think that all of these things, it's a much bigger picture than the kind of, Independence Day version of reality that you get. The inner Earth piece, is interesting, and this gets to a question. All of these mystery schools, and the Cayce work in particular, talk about elementals. He is so psychic that he interacts with elementals. Now, there's a group that went to Scotland using the Steiner methods for growing foods, and we know that's Findhorn. And when they got there, they were using these different, anthroposophical biodynamic farming rules, and they started to see beings, and they started to interact with them, and the beings told them how to make this garden and all the rest of it. And you might think they're crazy, but it happened with Cayce, and he interacted with them. And he also said that the being that he interacted with was very annoyed at human construction and interrupting their environment. And that was the general feeling, that the elemental beings weren't very happy with humanity. That can't be good. So there's something extra, I think, in all of these stories. I think that's why they come down to us the way that they do. And I think that the universe in that sense is teeming with life. Remember, Cayce, when he's giving a reading, they're like, "What do you mean discarnate entity? What are you talking about?" And he said, the soul consciousness that's passed on beyond human life, there are thousands about us here at present that seek expression. Not thousands of demons, thousands of discarnates, groups that have lived have had a physical normal life and then move on into that astral realm. They can still tune in here when something's going on. So the discarnate piece, I think, is something, as our awareness grows, you seem to have discarnates, elementals, inner Earth, alien. It's like, there's a wide range of things that we're not aware of because our senses have been trapped, in a sense, and held back in a way. So it is a period of being able to apprehend that. But I know, there are already psychics and people I've met who have those kinds of experiences. And I've met lots of people who've been taken by aliens and abducted and returned, and had that experience. And I don't doubt for a minute that it happened. So the question is, what is that? Who took them? What are they? And I think that has to remain in the realm of questions. And I think we get better answers going in through the mystery school lens than through, some kind of a traditional scientific lens, which is just concerned with how did they get here if they didn't have propulsion and fuel, whatever it would be, wouldn't operate on the same rules and level that we operate on. So, for me, the scientific backlash, the scientific blocking of these things is just absurd. And it's meant to keep people in a comfort zone about things, because in that comfort zone, they're easier to control, and they don't discover things that threaten the top level, God forbid they get behind the Atlantis mystery or the UFO mystery. That's real disclosure, and watch out. And with that,
one last final question.
Unbelievable.
Okay,
Yes.
it's good. Jimmy Lyle Kennemer, do you think Cayce had the same gift as the Bible prophets?
Yes, I think there's a reason why he's called the sleeping prophet. Something unusual about Cayce, let's face it. We've seen a lot of psychics, through we've heard the stories, and they're all remarkable. But Cayce is very unusual. And I think it's because of that lifetime as Ra-Ta, the Egyptian priest. And what's interesting is here's a weird thing that's in there. It's not explained. And he says, well, Ra-Ta was, he was sort of treated like a freak almost by his own group, who were these very, Aryan group coming down from the Carpathian, that whole Iran, Russia, those mountains, and coming in to Egypt. And the weird thing is he says, well, he was, they treated him strangely because he was a daughter. He was the son of a daughter of Zu, and he had no human father. So it's not explained who was Ra-Ta's father if it wasn't human. So is it Elohim? Is Ra-Ta is a very advanced being, and Cayce gives a complete description of him too. He's white with blue eyes, and he has no hair, no eyebrows, nothing. So, but he has a striking image, and he is the prophet for the group that's coming into Egypt, and he is leading this group into Egypt because he's saying we need to kind of keep the records here because Atlantis is going to go down, and I'm going to, he spends 25 years in Atlantis working with the initiates, assembling where to put the records at Giza. And Cayce's story is fascinating because what he says is that Giza is where they were doing archaeology because it was already in 10,500 BC a sacred ancient site. So, in Steiner's work, you can find him talking about how there was a temple of Isis there, 50,000 BC. How does that work? This is a very ancient fortress there, a very ancient plateau. So there's something special about it. And it has been underwater before and come up. So, we know we're dealing with something very, very unusual. And so if you get to that period with Cayce, when he's Ra-Ta and he goes and assembles all of these records from the Atlanteans to be buried in the Hall of Records, there's so much in that story. And what's interesting, if you follow the Cayce work, is so many of those people who were Ra-Ta's disciples come back to him now, and they're just ordinary, people, run supermarkets, all that stuff. And there's something very interesting about it because his very close initiates, he had given them a mark in that Egyptian period, and they would be reincarnated with the mark. So, beauty mark, whatever it happened to be, some little physical identifier. How does that work? That's a pretty deep thing. How do you reincarnate with the mark that you were given? There's something obviously that we don't understand yet about the depth of how that esoteric realm works. And the Ra-Ta story, I think, is still, remarkable and unexplained. But Cayce's abilities are not something that you find. Like, he seemed to have the ability, he could give health readings, he could do past life readings, he could diagnose a body in any place as long as he knew where the address was. And this very unusual ability to astral travel. There was one guy he was supposed to give a reading for in New York City who was supposed to be in his apartment. And they said, okay, we're going to give the reading and so on. Do you have the body? And he said, no, he's in a car coming across town. He's running late, but we'll wait. So, this is a pretty big kind of psychic satellite that he's working with. And then later they checked with the guy and they said, what happened? And the guy was like, oh yeah, I was caught in traffic, and I got here late. So Cayce is seeing it. There are another set of stories about Cayce where they're talking about certain medicines that he suggests. And then they go to the pharmacy and the pharmacy says, I don't know what that is. I've never heard of that. What are you talking about? So they go back to Cayce and they're like, what do you mean oil of smoke? What is that? And he says, tell him to go up to the third shelf, go 4 jars back. And, he directs him to where the thing is. They go back to it. And the guy's like, oh my God, I didn't even know this was here. So, apparently this is that incredible wide-scale vision directed in the proper way and with the proper purpose that can basically accomplish anything in terms of information. And they said to him once, what can a human being do by meditation or tapping into their psychic side? And he said, well, it's useful whether you're digging a garden or writing a concerto. You can get information on anything. Well, think about that. Another time they asked him, where do you get all this information that you're dishing out when somebody comes to you for a reading? And he said, from the subconscious mind of the person seeking the information, which means you already have it in there. And he's reading it like a book. Absolutely incredible. And that's what's so fascinating about tonight's episode, Atlantis NightSide UFOs. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Just outstanding and a great crew the whole night through. And I know that's a deep one. Miss Olivia, you're up.
Okay, I have a lot of super chatters to thank. Don Newway, Richard Farrow, Debbie McAdoo, Les Scott, Gillenjoy R, Kathleen Beck, W.C. Ray, Jay Parsons, Karen Carpenter, Pretty Good, The Weed in Your Garden, Terry Doherty, Global Atlantis, Peter Rabbit, Robert Scott, Thomas Ball, Doreen Hewitt, Catherine Rorden, Hizzo, Jack Black, Eurythmia's Fun, Xavier Figueroa, Farmer Dick, The Buddhas of Boston Sports, Number 6, Talcott Phillips, Stacy Chiuli, Jonathan McIntosh, Griffin Eagle 7, Susan Blackstone, BC Infinitum Neo, Jennifer Walters, and The Secret Spaceship. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Unbelievable. Just incredible. And just super to be with you and to get your support. We appreciate it for everything that we do here. And to all our subscribers and supporters, thank you. We will be back with you. We have a special report coming up on the 2024 election, and we're just working out now when to do it. So there's a lot of things coming up here, but this might happen very quickly. So I might even send out an email this weekend. So watch for it.
You mean like we might go live tomorrow night?
Yes.
Okay.
So I'm working on it, and please pay attention. We'll send out that newsletter for you. That'll be about an 1.5-hour report, but I have some special information in relation to the censorship on the 2024 election and how crucial this is going to be, America in peril, as it were. So be on the lookout for that, and we will probably see you all tomorrow night. Miss Olivia?
Sorry, just thanking Ghost Malone for another super chat.
Fantastic.
That's it. Thanks.
All right.
Thanks so much.
We will see you all tomorrow night, and also next week we're doing we have a special interview coming up for you as well. So watch your newsletter. Lots going on there. And of course, if you haven't already, subscribe to the program. And we have a new episode that we're going to do coming up also with Gigi Young. So watch out for that, and the incredible work that Gigi's doing on her YouTube channel. Just phenomenal and incredible kind of complement to the work that we do here. So you want to make sure you catch up with all the great stuff she has going on. We will see you all tomorrow night. And, it says end broadcast, but after all, it never really ends.
Nope. Never does.
And, an interesting little aside about Cayce is that they say here that according to the readings, not only did Atlantis exist, but the breadth of technology and industry at that time surpassed our own. This is the interesting, fascinating thing as we get to it, that there was a culture back there that exceeded what we had. That's why this is important. So we will see you all tomorrow night. Thanks very much. I'll do a couple of shout outs, actually. Keeping an eye out for that one. Thank you, Nina says. Love to everyone. I've got to get this mic comfortable here. Let's go, Brandon. That's
Never gets old.
Najat Madre. Thanks. Great to have you here. Doyle Wayne. Fantastic, sir. Golden Girl. What's for dinner? Pono. Stellar Rendition. Gem Passivant. Great to have you here. What?
Shane Walker says, more Pawgate.
Pawgate. Listen, Pawgate is crucial. There's going to be more coming up on that. There's more revelations coming this way. And that's a deep set of information, let's face it. I love you, man. Thank you. Peter Rabbit, it's great to see you, sir. Havardian, DJ are an example to us all. Well, you guys are an example for me. Blue Man, Ghost Malone, Pawgate. Yes, you know what's coming at you. Fantastic. I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you. I know Joseph was out there. Might have passed out. I think he did his own show tonight. Johann Wolf, spiritual technology, not what you think. It's deep in here. Mr. Hemptress, Mrs. Hemptress, I'm sorry. Shout out to all fellow women and humans. Oh, hilarious. Thanks, you two, and Miss Gigi. Fantastic. Wow. Hey, that's like the lottery. You got both comments. Nicely done. Gil and Joy R, fantastic. Thank you for being with us. We really appreciate it. We will see you all tomorrow night, and watch the newsletter. I think it's going to be sometime around 8 o'clock or so. So thanks so much. And catch up on that RFK Jr. part. We'll fill you in on it tomorrow night. So, Miss Olivia.
Okay.
Bravo. Nicely done.
Right. I'm
Great
starving.
Remember, and never let it be forgot, once there was a Camelot.